Study debunks Stephen Jay Gould's claim of racism on Morton's skulls. From the NewYorkTimes.com, scientists measure the accuracy of a racism claim. Scientists have often been accused of letting their ideology influence the results, and one of the most famous cases is that of Morton's skulls, the global collection amassed by the 19th century physical anthropologist Samuel George Morton. In a 1981 book, The Mismeasure of Man, the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould asserted that Morton, believing that brain size was a measure of intelligence, had subconsciously manipulated the brain volumes of European, Asian, and African skulls to favor his bias that Europeans had larger brains and Africans smaller ones. But now, physical anthropologists at the University of Pennsylvania, which owns Morton's collection, have remeasured the skulls, and in an article that does little to burnish Dr. Gould's reputation as a scholar, they conclude that almost every detail of his analysis is wrong. Our results resolve this historical controversy, demonstrating that Morton did not manipulate his data to support his preconceptions, contra Gould. They write in the current PLOS Psychology. I don't know what that is. Dr. Gould, who died in 2002, based his attack on the premise that Morton believed that brain size was correlated with intelligence. But there is no evidence that Morton believed this or was trying to prove it, said Jason E. Lewis, the leader of the Pennsylvania team. Rather, Morton was measuring his skulls to study human variation as part of his inquiry into whether God had created the human races separately, a lively issue before Darwin decreed that everyone belonged to the same species. In his book, Dr. Gould contended that Morton's results were, quote, a patchwork of fudging and finagling in the clear interest of controlling a priori convictions. This fudging was not deliberate, Dr. Gould said, but rather an instance of unconscious doctoring of data, a practice he believed was, quote, rampant, endemic, and unavoidable in science. His finding is widely cited as an instance of scientific bias and fallibility. But the Penn team finds Morton's results were neither fudged nor influenced by his convictions. They identified and remeasured half of the skulls used in his reports, finding that in only 2% of the cases did Morton's measurements differ significantly from their own. These errors were either random or gave a larger than accurate volume to African skulls, the reverse of the bias that Dr. Gould imputed to Morton. These results falsify the claim that Morton physically mismeasured crania based on his a priori biases, the Pennsylvania team writes. Dr. Gould did not measure any of the skulls himself, but merely did a paper reanalysis of Morton's results. He accused Morton of various subterfuges, like leaving out subgroups to manipulate a group's overall score. When these errors were corrected, Dr. Gould said, quote, there are no differences to speak of among Morton's races, close quote. But Dr. Gould himself omitted subgroups in his own reanalysis and made various errors in his calculations. When these are corrected, the differences between the racial categories recognized by Morton are as he assigned them. Quote, ironically, Gould's own analysis of Morton is likely the stronger example of a bias influencing results, the Pennsylvania team writes. You think? Dr. Lewis, the lead author, said that on checking the references for some of Dr. Gould's accusations, he found that Morton had not made the errors attributed to him. Quote, those elements of Gould's work were surprising, he said. I can't say if they were deliberate. Dr. Lewis, who is now at Stanford University, began the project while at Penn. An earlier study by John S. Michael, then an graduate at Macalester College in St. Paul, concluded that Morton's results were, quote, reasonably accurate, close quote, with no clear sign of manipulation. But when others suggested Dr. Gould had been refuted, Philip Kitcher, a philosopher of science at Columbia University, rode to his defense. Oh boy. Quote, it is not entirely evident that one should prefer the measurement of an undergraduate to those of professional paleontologists, he wrote in 2004. Quote, pending further measurement of the skulls and further analysis of the data, it seems best to let this grubby affair rest in a footnote. Dr. Kitcher said last week that a Penn team had done a very careful job and that it's a nice thing that undergraduate work gets vindicated. As for the new findings bearing on Dr. Gould's reputation, Dr. Kitcher said, quote, Steve doesn't come out as a rogue, but as someone who makes mistakes. If Steve were around, he would probably defend himself with great ingenuity. But Ralph L. Holloway, an expert on human evolution at Columbia and a co-author of the new study was less willing to give Dr. Gould the benefit of the doubt. Quote, "I just don't trust Gould," he said. "I had the feeling that his ideological stance was supreme. When the 1996 version of The Mismeasure of Man came and he never even bothered to mention Michael's study, I just felt that he was a charlatan." A new look at old data may discredit a theory on race. From the New York Times. Two physical anthropologists have reanalyzed data gathered by Franz Boas, a founder of American anthropology, and report that he erred in saying environment influenced human head shape. Boas's data, the two scientists say, show almost no such effect. The reanalysis bears on whether craniometrics, the measurement of skull shape, can validly identify ethnic origin. As such, it may prompt a reevaluation of the definition of human races and of ancient skulls like that of Kennewick Man. "I have used Boas's study to fight what I guess would be considered racist approaches to anthropology," said Dr. Thomas, curator of anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History, New York. "I have to say, I am shocked at the findings." Forensic anthropologists believe that by taking some 90 measurement of a skull, they can correctly assign its owner's continent of origin, broadly speaking, its race, though many anthropologists prefer not to use that term, with 80% accuracy. That is, they can identify someone's race with 80% accuracy by taking 90 measurements of the skull. Opponents of this technique, who cite Boas's data, say this technique is useless in part because of environmental influences, like nutrition or the chewiness of food, would overwhelm genetic effects. Boas measured the heads of 13,000 European-born immigrants and their American-born children in 1909 and 1910 and reported striking effects on cranial form depending on the length of exposure to the American environment. But in re-examining his published data, Dr. Corey S. Sparks of Pennsylvania State University and Dr. Richard L. Jantz of the University of Tennessee find that the effects of the new environment were insignificant and that the differences between parents and children and between European and American-born children were negligible in comparison to the differentiation between ethnic groups. They are reporting today in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The groups that Boas studied were Bohemians, Hungarians, Central Italians, Jews, Poles, Sicilians, and Scots. As to why he drew the wrong conclusions, Drs. Sparks and Jantz note that he was much involved in disputing contemporary belief that many different racial types could be reliably distinguished. Boas's motives, they write, quote, "could have been entwined with his view that the racist and typological nature of early anthropology should end, and his argument for dramatic changes in head form would provide evidence sufficient to cull the typological thinking." Dr. Jantz said that Boas was, quote, "intent on showing that the scientific racism of the day had no basis, but he did have to shade his data some to make it work that way," close quote. "Corey and I," Dr. Jantz said, "certainly aren't arguing that scientific racism is something you should go back to, but that doesn't mean cranial morphology is meaningless either," like that boogeyman term, scientific racism. Woo. Continue. The new report raises the issue whether an earlier generation's efforts to play down the role of genetics in fields like behavior and racial variation may not have been carried to extremes. Dr. Steven Pinker, who assigns a larger role to genetics in shaping behavior in his book The Blank Slate, said it was not Boas, but his disciples, including the anthropologists Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and Ashley Montague, who, quote, helped establish the blank slate, social constructionist, anti-biology mindset of the social sciences, close quote. Dr. Thomas said that, quote, once we anthropologists said race doesn't exist, we have ignored it since then, close quote. In that context, the reanalysis of Boas's data, quote, really does have far-reaching ramifications, close quote, he said. One is the question whether present-day races existed as such in the past, an issue brought up by the discovery of Kennewick Man. The skeleton, including a Caucasoid-looking skull 9,000 years old, was found by a Columbia River bank in Washington. Indians and their supporters contend that the skull differs from present-day Indians because of environmental changes. Scientists who want to study the skull, instead of handing it over for reburial, said it was evidence that other ancestral groups had reached North America besides the Central Asians whom Indians most closely resemble. In Skull Wars, his recent book on Kennewick Man, Dr. Thomas argued that it was bad science to introduce racial concepts like Caucasoid in the context of people who lived 9,000 years ago, because environmental factors would have extensively changed body shape since then. Scientists on the other side, who included Dr. Jantz, quote, took a lot of heat in saying they could project racial classifications back in time, Dr. Thomas said. Because no DNA was extracted from Kennewick Man, craniometrics is the only way to learn about his population, Dr. Sparks said. By that measure, the skull most closely resembles those of the Ainu, the original inhabitants of Japan who now live in the country's most northern islands. Boas's immigrant data, Dr. Sparks said, quote, has been the burr in our bed for 90 years for people who tried to study population history using cranial data, close quote. I would love to see this wrong, Dr. Thomas said, but I don't see any holes in the study. But Dr. Alan H. Goodman, a biological anthropologist at Hampshire College, said that the authors were setting up a straw man by, quote, purporting to show that Boas was a rampant environmentalist when in fact he wasn't. I believe Dr. Alan Goodman is wrong, given Franz Boas's sympathies with Marxism and the blank slate theory of human nature that Marxism requires. This is an excerpt from the article Egalitarian Fiction and the Collective Fraud from the March-April 1994 edition of the journal Society. Quote, in one-party science, the disfavored line of work is subject to intense scrutiny and nearly impossible standards, while the favored line of work is held to lax standards in which flaws are overlooked, called oversight bias in the psychological literature. Similarly, the disfavored idea is rejected unless it is balanced by including proponents of the favored view, even if that view is the equivalent of the flat earth theory. Where the favored line of work is readily accepted for publication and presentation, even when it totally ignores the opposing literature. Getting a controversial paper accepted under such circumstances often becomes a test of endurance between the editor and reviewers in coming up with criticisms and the author in rebutting them. The double standards can even ricochet back and forth depending on the particular question being considered. Gordon recalls how sociologists failed to criticize sociologist James Coleman for omitting student ability from his analysis of school integration, which led to overstating the impact of integrated schools on black achievement, for sociologists a favored outcome, but how they criticized him, roundly, for the very same omission in analysis of private versus public schools, which led to the overstating of the impact of private schools on black achievement, an unfavorable outcome according to the sociologist. In short, in one-party science, scientific regard flows like political patronage to loyal and active party members who can demonstrate their loyalty by being alert to hints of dissidence. Like all one-party political systems, one-party science becomes intellectually corrupt and arrogant as it gains confidence in its power.
So I should just like to tell, if I may, one brief story. In the 19th century in England, there was a real debate over the age of the Earth. One group of geologists had studied the rate of sedimentation of the rocks and had concluded that the Earth had to be hundreds of millions of years old. Another group of geologists measured the temperature of the volcanoes and the rate of cooling of the globe and concluded that the Earth could not be more than 5 million years old because it would have cooled otherwise. So here are two groups of first-class scientists, both of whom are apparently right. So how did these two groups of scientists deal with a dilemma? Did they say to themselves, Professor Popper says that if you're falsified, you are wrong and you must change your course? Or did they say, we're sticking to our story and we're ignoring falsification? The dilemma of science is that all great scientists ignore falsification. It is almost a definition of greatness that you ignore what others say, you stick to your suspicions and beliefs, and you seek to prove what you secretly know in advance to be true. That is actually the nature of science, and it has to be the nature of science because there are too many observations out there. You have to select your observations, you have to select your theory, and then you spend your life trying to prove it, which is why they say that science advances funeral by funeral because no one ever changes their mind. All scientists always grab a hypothesis and seek to prove it, and peer review is merely a group of people within the same club, all of whom share certain pre-assumptions, and therefore peer review can often be very deceptive. So to finish, all scientists are advocates. They are not judges. Scientists do not seek to say this is right and this is wrong based on the evidence before me. What scientists do is they are advocates. They say, I believe this is the case and I will do everything I can to prove it. And anyone who reads a scientific paper and doesn't understand that all scientists are only advocates and it can take 20 or 30 years before we really know what the truth is after everyone has died, does not understand the process of science.
It is regrettable that philosophers are not more conscious before they resort to the heavy artillery of political accusations. If it seems that a respected scholar has been blind about something very simple and elementary, minimal fairness requires that you think twice and read twice in order to make sure that perhaps it was not you who misunderstood the person in question. Now that the skeptical heretic can't interrupt and derail me, I can actually present a complete case for racial hereditarianism. First, I will go over polls and mainstream scientific belief on race and on intelligence and IQ tests. The point being to show that the egalitarians' vaunted consensus is nothing more than a phantasm. Second, I will talk about the importance of the issue of hereditarianism and egalitarianism, why this issue matters, and why making policy decisions based on egalitarian assumptions would be disastrous should those assumptions turn out to be false. Third, I will go over some very basic concepts needed to understand how groups and aggregates work, and how inferences of genetic causation work, the validity of IQ, and we'll go over the widely recognized formal fallacies that form the backbone of egalitarian argumentation. Fourth, I will make the hereditarian case and respond to the strongest egalitarian arguments I know of, and it is in my interest to really pick the strongest arguments since the viewers of this kind of video will inevitably come into contact with them if they haven't already. So let's start off with the consensus on intelligence. Following the publication of the bell curve, psychology professor Linda Gottfredson drafted a public statement called Mainstream Science on Intelligence, which was signed by 51 other university professors specializing in psychometrics and related fields. It was published in the Wall Street Journal on December 13, 1994. Let's read it. Quote, since the publication of the bell curve, many commentators have offered opinions about human intelligence that misstate current scientific evidence. Some conclusions dismissed in the media as discredited are actually firmly supported. This statement outlines conclusions regarded as mainstream among researchers on intelligence, in particular on the nature, origins, and practical consequences of individual and group differences in intelligence. Its aim is to promote more reasoned discussion of the vexing phenomenon that the research has revealed in recent decades. The following conclusions are fully described in the major textbooks, professional journals, and encyclopedias on intelligence. The meaning and measurement of intelligence. 1. Intelligence is a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, for catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. 2. Intelligence, so defined, can be measured, and intelligence tests measure it well. They are among the most accurate, in technical terms the most reliable and valid, of all psychological tests and assessments. They do not measure creativity, character, personality, or other important differences among individuals, nor are they intended to. 3. While there are different types of intelligence tests, they all measure the same intelligence. Some use words or numbers and require specific cultural knowledge. Others do not, and instead use shapes or designs and require knowledge of only simple universal concepts. 4. The spread of people along the IQ continuum from low to high can be represented well by the bell curve, or in statistical jargon, the normal distribution. Most people cluster around the average IQ of 100. Few are either very bright or very dull. About 3% of Americans score above 130, with about the same percentage below 70. 5. Intelligence tests are not culturally biased against American blacks or other native-born English-speaking peoples in the U.S. Rather, IQ scores predict equally accurately for all such Americans, regardless of race and social class. Individuals who do not understand English well can be given either a nonverbal test or one in their native language. 6. The brain processes underlying intelligence are still little understood. Current research looks, for example, at the speed of neural transmission, glucose uptake, and electrical activity in the brain. Group differences. 7. Members of all racial ethnic groups can be found at every IQ level. The bell curves of different groups overlap considerably, but groups often differ in where their members tend to cluster along the IQ line. The bell curves for some groups, Jews and East Asians, are centered somewhat higher than for whites in general. Other groups, blacks and Hispanics, are centered somewhat lower than non-Hispanic whites. 8. The bell curve for whites is centered roughly around IQ 100, the bell curve for American blacks roughly around 85, and those for different subgroups of Hispanics roughly midway between those for whites and blacks. The evidence is less definitive for exactly where above IQ 100 the bell curves for Jews and East Asians are centered. Just a note here, the whites is not centered roughly around IQ 100, it is centered at IQ 100. Whatever scores is the average IQ score for whites, that's set to 100. Okay. Back to this. Practical importance. 9. IQ is strongly related, probably more so than any other single measurable human trait, to many important educational, occupational, economic, and social outcomes. Its relation to the welfare and performance of individuals is very strong in some areas of life, education, military training, moderate but robust in others, social competence, and modest but consistent in others, law-abidingness. Whatever IQ tests measure, it is of great practical and social importance. 10. A high IQ is an advantage in life because virtually all activities require some reasoning and decision-making. Conversely, a low IQ is often a disadvantage, especially in disorganized environments. Of course, a high IQ is no more a guarantee of success than a low IQ guarantees failure in life. There are many exceptions, but the odds for success in our society greatly favor individuals with higher IQs. 11. The practical advantages of having a higher IQ increases as life settings become more complex, more novel, ambiguous, changing, unpredictable, or multifaceted. For example, a high IQ is generally necessary to perform well in highly complex or fluid jobs, the professions or management. It is a considerable advantage in moderately complex jobs like crafts, clerical, and police work, but it provides less advantage in settings that require only routine decision-making or simple problem-solving, unskilled work. 12. Differences in intelligence certainly are not the only factor affecting performance in education, training, and highly complex jobs. No one claims they are, but intelligence is often the most important. When individuals have already been selected for high or low intelligence, and so do not differ as much in IQ as in graduate school or special education, other influences on performance loom larger in comparison than the IQ score. 13. Certain personality traits, special talents, aptitudes, physical capabilities, experience, and the like are important, sometimes essential, for successful performance in many jobs, but they have narrower or unknown applicability or transferability across tasks and settings, compared with general intelligence. Some scholars choose to refer to these other human traits as other intelligences, but general intelligence is more generalizable. It can be used in more things, whereas specialized knowledge is specialized and specific and not necessarily applicable to other tasks. Source and stability of within-group differences. 14. Individuals' difference in intelligence due to differences in both their environments and genetic heritage. Heritability estimates range from 0.4 to 0.8 on a scale from 0 to 1, most thereby indicating that genetics plays a bigger role than does environment in creating IQ differences among individuals. And that's key. Right here, they're not saying between blacks and whites. They're saying among all individuals in the great aggregate of the humanity which this heritability rating applies to. Heritability is the squared correlation of phenotype with genotype. If all environments were to become equal for everyone, heritability would rise to 100% because all remaining differences in IQ would necessarily be genetic in origin. Just for a note, this is what I was trying to explain to the skeptical heretic, and he was not getting it, and the audience was obviously siding with him, so I really couldn't advance it very well. But this is mainstream science on intelligence, yes. So the higher heritability in sub-Saharan Africa is not relevant to the 0.4 to 0.8 heritability within the U.S. That is mainstream opinion on the heritability of IQ. 15. Members of the same family also tend to differ substantially in intelligence, by an average of about 12 IQ points, for both genetic and environmental reasons. They differ genetically because biological brothers and sisters share exactly half their genes with each parent and, on the average, only half with each other. They also differ in IQ because they experience different environments within the same family. 16. That IQ may be highly heritable does not mean that it is not affected by the environment. individuals are not born with fixed, unchangeable levels of intelligence. No one claims they are. IQs do gradually stabilize during childhood, however, and generally change little thereafter. 17. Although the environment is important in creating IQ differences, we do not know yet how to manipulate it to raise low IQs permanently. Whether recent attempts show promise is still a matter of considerable scientific debate. This is from 1994, of course, and there were attempts to raise IQ through intensive environmental interventions later on, which I will get to in the rest of this presentation. 18. Genetically caused differences are not necessarily irredeemable. Consider diabetes, poor vision, and phenylketonuria, nor are environmentally caused ones necessarily not necessarily irremediable. Same, irredeemable. Okay. Alike, consider injuries, poison, severe neglect, and some diseases. Both may be preventable to some extent. Source and stability of between-group differences. 19. There is no persuasive evidence that the IQ bell curves for different racial and ethnic groups are converging. Surveys in some years show that gaps in academic achievement have narrowed a bit for some races, ages, school subjects, and skill levels, but this picture seems too mixed to reflect a general shift in IQ levels themselves. I will get to the Flynn Dickens contention that the black-white IQ gap has narrowed in recent years, which was done after 1994. 20. Racial ethnic differences in IQ bell curves are essentially the same when youngsters leave high school as when they enter first grade. However, because bright youngsters learn faster than slow youngsters, these same IQ differences lead to growing disparities in amount learned as youngsters progress from grades 1 to 12. As large national surveys continue to show, black 17-year-olds perform, on the average, more like white 13-year-olds in reading, math, and science, with Hispanics in between. 21. The reasons that blacks differ among themselves in intelligence appear to be basically the same as those for why whites, or Asians, or Hispanics differ among themselves. Both environment and genetic heredity are involved. 22. There is no definitive answer to why IQ bell curves differ across racial ethnic groups. The reasons for these IQ differences between groups may be markedly different from the reasons for why individuals differ among themselves within any particular groups, whites or blacks or Asians or whatever. In fact, it is wrong to assume, as many do, that the reason why some individuals in a population have high IQs but others have low IQs must be the same reason why populations contain more such high or low IQ individuals than others. Most experts believe that environment is important in pushing the bell curves apart, but that genetics could be involved too. 23. Racial ethnic differences are somewhat smaller but still substantial for individuals from the same socioeconomic backgrounds. To illustrate, black students from prosperous families tend to score higher in IQ than blacks from poor families, but they score no higher, on average, than whites from poor families. 24. Almost all Americans who identify themselves as black have white ancestors. The white admixture is about 20% on average, and many self-designated whites, Hispanics, and others likewise have mixed ancestry. Because research on intelligence relies on self-classification into distinct racial categories, as does most other social science research, its findings likewise relate to some unclear mixture of social and biological distinctions among groups. No one claims otherwise. Implications for social policy. 25. The research findings neither dictate nor preclude any particular social policy because they can never determine our goals. They can, however, help us determine the likely success and side effects of pursuing those goals via different means. Close quote. So as you can see, the mainstream scientific position is very close to the position of hereditarians. It's not exactly our position, right, with all this talk of between group heritability being less than 1, or a high environmental influence in between race IQ gaps, but it's pretty close. Compare this to Evogen's position that IQ is not heritable at all, period. Not that environment can play a big role, not that there's big gains that can be made through equalizing environment, but that IQ is not heritable at all, full stop. This view is very radical. That doesn't necessarily make it wrong. Perhaps Evogen has a key insight that these researchers don't have, but I think that the YouTube atheists are getting the impression that their views are mainstream, when they're really quite radical. The hereditarian position on race and the hereditarian position on IQ is definitely closer to the mainstream scientific consensus than is the radical egalitarianism of people like Evogen and the skeptical heretic. The mainstream consensus is close to the racial hereditarian position, but it's not quite the racial hereditarian position, of course. On point number 22, where it says, there is no definitive answer to why the IQ bell curves differ across racial ethnic groups, this is something that I will be challenging in this video. Next, let's go into the consensus on race. What about race? Does race exist? Well, what egalitarians love to do is make appeals to how population geneticists and physical anthropologists don't view race as a valid or useful concept. And that's fine. But at least Polish and Chinese physical anthropologists do view race as a valid concept. According to Katarzyna Kazika and Goran Strakilj, I have no idea how to pronounce these Polish names, of the 125 respondents in their poll of European cultural anthropologists, 50% agreed that human races exist. Interesting. Of the results, they said, quote, 3 of these factors, country of academic education, discipline, and age, were found to be significant in differentiating these replies. Respondents educated in Western Europe, physical anthropologists, and middle-aged persons tend to reject race more frequently than respondents educated in Eastern Europe, people in other branches of science, and those from both the younger and older generations. Okay, and that's interesting. People from both the younger and older generations view race as valid, and this actually conforms to my suspicion that what happened was that there was something of an egalitarian political movement that started in the 1960s, but really came into being in the 1970s, and so that generation, which is middle-aged now, has the most ridiculous views on race. Eastern Europe, being behind the Iron Curtain, was not affected by it. And of course, obviously, China was not affected by it. But that's just my explanation for the pattern of views here. Virtually all forensic anthropologists recognize race as valid, according to George Gill, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Wyoming. In an article debate on race that he had on this NOVA thing, Gill wrote something which I found to be very insightful. Maybe you'll find it insightful too. He said, quote, "Yet I do see why many other physical anthropologists are able to ignore or deny the race concept. Blood factor analysis for existence shows many traits that cut across racial boundaries in a purely clinal fashion with very few, if any, breaks along racial boundaries. A cline is a gradient of change, such as from people with a high frequency of blue eyes, as in Scandinavia, to a people with a high frequency of brown eyes, as in Africa. Morphological characteristics, however, like skin color, hair form, bone traits, eyes, and lips, tend to follow geographic boundaries coinciding often with climatic zones. This is not surprising since the selective forces of climate are probably the primary forces of nature that have shaped human races with regard not only to skin color and hair form, but also the underlying bony structures of the nose, cheekbones, etc. For example, more prominent noses humidify the air better, right, which is why Africans have wider noses. And that also causes them to look a little bit more like apes who live in hot environments as well. Right? Both apes and black Africans have lived in hot environments, so they need the wider nose that helps them humidify the air. Continuing. As far as we know, blood factor frequencies are not shaped by these same climatic factors. So serologists who work largely with blood factors will tend to see human variation as clinal and races as not a valid construct, while skeletal biologists, particularly forensic anthropologists, will see races as biologically real. The common person on the street who sees only a person's skin color, hair form, and face shape will also tend to see races as biologically real. They're not incorrect. Their perspective is just different from that of the serologist. So yes, I see truth on both sides of the race argument." Close quote. So at the very least, this consensus that egalitarians like to point to is a chimera. There is no consensus. Of course, this kind of appeal to authority that the egalitarians were doing is a fallacy called the appeal to authority fallacy. But in addition to it being a fallacy, what the egalitarians are saying is just factually incorrect. On race. Now, since this is my video, I will give you my opinion. Whether or not race exists is kind of an asinine debate, and let me give 3 reasons why that is. 1, self-reported race and ethnicity corresponds with genetic cluster almost perfectly. Here's the abstract from the study, quote, genetic structure, self-identified race and ethnicity, and confounding and case-controlled association studies. Quote, we have analyzed genetic data from 326 microsatellite markers that were typed uniformly in a large multi-ethnic population-based samples of individuals as part of a study of the genetics of hypertension family blood pressure program. Subjects identified themselves as belonging to one of the four major racial ethnic groups, white, African American, East Asian, and Hispanic, and were recruited from 15 different geographic locales within the United States and Taiwan. Genetic cluster analysis of the microsatellite markers produced 4 major clusters, which showed near perfect correspondence with the 4 self-reported race and ethnicity categories. So just looking at the data, they formed 4 major clusters, which happened to correspond with race and ethnicity categories that were self-reported. Of 3,636 subjects of varying race and ethnicity, only 5, 0.14%, showed genetic cluster membership different from their self-identified race or ethnicity. On the other hand, we detected only modest genetic differentiation between different current geographic locales within each race and ethnicity group. Thus, ancient geographic ancestry, which is highly correlated with self-identified race and ethnicity, as opposed to current residence, is the major determinant of genetic structure in the U.S. population. Implications of this genetic structure for case-control association studies are discussed, close quote. The full study is linked in the description. So even if race doesn't exist according to some constructed definition of race, the fact is that self-identified race corresponds with genetic cluster groups. And this gets into the my second point. Any definition of race is subjective, just like all definitions. There is genetic variation, and there is genetic clustering, and you can draw the lines wherever you want. You can draw the lines anywhere. You can base your racial categorizations on height and say that there is a tall race and a short race. What is a chair? What is a species? There are debates about what constitutes a species. What is a feminine face and what is a masculine face? Now, scientists can construct an absurd, can construct definitions for these things, but that doesn't make the definitions that they construct real, okay? They could construct an absurd, unreasonable definition of a feminine and masculine face and use that straw man definition to say that masculine and feminine faces don't exist. And that's what's being done with race. Race, like the idea of a masculine and feminine face, is a pre-scientific concept. That is, people came up with the concept of race and ascribed to different behavior patterns innate causation between the races before any understanding of genetics. So when scientists then come up and say, I define race as being X number of allele frequency differences. Oh look, the populations labeled black people and white people only differ by Y number of allele frequency differences, therefore they're not separate races. Right? So you see what they're doing? They can draw the line anywhere. They can set the standard anywhere. So instead of defining race in terms of how it was historically used, in terms of expressed traits, right, the same way they do with forests, mountains, and lakes, and the way they do it with similarly ambiguous concepts like feminine and masculine faces and feminine and masculine voices, they define race not by its own criteria and how it was used, but by things like allele frequency variations, and construct a definition that of race that can't be met. In short, they are straw manning race with a definition that is just out of reach of race. 3. Even if you can show me that race doesn't exist by some correct standard or some, whatever that would even, I don't know what that would even mean, but even if you could do that, it doesn't matter. And let me illustrate why that doesn't matter with a thought experiment. Imagine a group of white people with dimples and a group of white people without dimples. The dimpled whites have an average IQ of 85, and the non-dimpled whites have an average IQ of 100. This IQ difference between the dimpled and non-dimpled whites is entirely a result of genetics, let's say. Right, just for the thought experiment, we're going to say it's entirely a result of genetics. Now, there are some dimpled whites with IQs above 100, and there are some non-dimpled whites with IQs below 85. But the averages are what they are, and we are saying for this thought experiment that they are innate. Now, what if someone responded to this by pointing out that the dimpled whites aren't a different race according to some definition of race? Right. The dimpled whites are not a separate race, therefore you can't say this. Well, your response should be two things. First, that that saying that they're not a different race is a matter of opinion, nothing more. And second, that's irrelevant because this defined population, be it another race or not, differs in a trait at an innate level. And this trait difference may only be the result of an allele frequency variation in 10 genes, or 1 gene. It doesn't matter. Now, I think you can see where I'm going with this. Black people have an average IQ of 85, white people an average IQ of 100. Black people are like the dimpled whites, except their superficial racial markers are much more than a dimple. Of course, I still have to present evidence that the racial disparities are a result of genetic differences. This thought experiment was simply to map out the principles here. Let's go over some political movements and social policy inspired by egalitarian thought. First, affirmative action. From the National Policy Institute's paper, The Cost of Diversity, quote, Peter Brimelow, writing several years ago in Forbes, calculated cumulative affirmative action costs to the U.S. economy at $225 billion, or 4% of GDP in 1991. In other words, had the funds been spent to enforce and comply with affirmative action programs since their inception been put to other, more productive use, research and development, or plant modernization, for example, then GDP would have been 4% higher in 1991. If Brimelow's 4% figure is accurate, and to my knowledge no one has ever challenged it, then the cost of affirmative action programs would currently be about $540 billion. But nearly 15 years have passed since Brimelow made his calculation. Even if the same affirmative action programs are in place, their impact would be larger today because they have been in existence longer. The economic cost of affirmative action compounds annually as the growth of the economy increasingly diverges from its potential. Bottom line, the misallocation that cost 4% of GDP in 1991 could easily cost 8% of GDP today, 2007. That implies a $1.1 trillion economic loss from affirmative action programs, a whopping $3,667 taken from every man, woman, and child in the country. So, for whites and Asians, this totals minus $144 trillion per year. For a comparison, the GDP of sub-Saharan Africa is roughly $1.475 trillion. This is all of Africa except Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Now, blacks and Hispanics do gain from affirmative action in the most direct sense. So, if you factor in their gains, the total direct cost of affirmative action comes out to about $1.1 trillion instead of $1.44 trillion in 2007, or about 8% of GDP in 2007. But remember, that's continued to compound, so it's probably a little bit higher now. Whether or not you support affirmative action, you cannot deny that it was inspired by egalitarian views on race. So what have these programs done? Well, black income as a percentage of white income has remained virtually unchanged since 1959. None of the predictions of civil rights came true. The academic gaps remain virtually the same. The Milwaukee voucher study showed that students who apply for vouchers and get them do no better than students who apply for vouchers and don't get them. And I think this is something that most people have suspected for a long time, that school quality, quote-unquote, is largely a myth. At the schools you go to, there are kids who learn nothing and get terrible grades. And it has nothing to do with the school they're at, because they're going to the same school you are. Yet, we are to assume that black schools have poor averages because of something inherent in the school itself, despite the voucher studies saying otherwise. This narrative is based on an egalitarian view of race. It can't be the race, it must be the school. It must be the environment. Say what you wish about forced segregation being a moral crime, which I would agree with, and that is how civil rights should really be looked at, as a moral issue of people being prevented from doing things, being stripped of their dignity. That is the issue. But the idea that it was the cause of these gaps is unsupported. The blacks in the southern U.S., for the most part, chose to stay in the southern U.S. during the Jim Crow period and during segregation. There were no walls, there were no patrols to keep black people in the South, yet most of them chose to stay right up through the 1940s and 1950s. Compare this to North Korea or Communist China or the Soviet Union. In actual oppressive regimes, they had to seal the borders to keep people in. And of course, the population in those countries are, and in North Korea's case still are, much poorer than American blacks. And American blacks, by global standards, are some of the richest people on the planet. Moreover, the black-white income gap today is virtually the same as it was in 1959. Now, with income, it's a bit different depending on the economy, because different skills might be needed differently. So the black-white income gap will probably just fluctuate, just as we would, just by not as a result of any systematic narrowing, but we would expect some fluctuation as the basket of skills become valued differently as technology changes. But the main point is that there was no systematic narrowing of the income gap following civil rights. And this can be interpreted as the oppression remaining despite the end of legal segregation, or it can be interpreted as very little oppression ever having existed in economic terms in the first place, as evidenced by the profound lack of emigration from the South. Also keep in mind that even in the Jim Crow South, blacks were still net recipients of social services. But we have a hard time accepting that, don't we? It's become canon that the civil rights movement was overcoming some brutal oppression that was keeping blacks down. Now, I don't want to say that I think that this was a good regime or that these forced segregation laws were a good thing. I'm simply saying that they don't appear to be the cause of the economic gaps. So let's look at some other lies percolating around what I like to call the civil rights mythology. We'll start off with black invention myths. Now, at first, I didn't know if I should go over black invention myths because, on the one hand, it makes me look like a racist, but on the other hand, it is a very clear example of egalitarians being wrong, and it's a very brazen example since this was a commercial on national TV. So I thought, well, I could be viewed as a racist for going over this, but the thing is, that ship has kind of sailed, so I'm going to go through this. False history from the civil rights lobby is nothing new. We can see a much clearer example of this in the form of black invention myths. Let's take a look at a 2011 advertisement from the United Negro College Fund.
These things we count on every day started as ideas. Ideas from the minds of African Americans. Support minority education today so we don't miss out on the next big idea tomorrow. The United Negro College Fund. A mind is a terrible thing to waste.
Okay, first, the mailbox. According to black invention mythology, the street letterbox was invented in 1891 by P. Downing, and the private mailbox was invented by George Beckett in 1892. According to the U.S. Postal Service, street mailboxes appeared in large U.S. cities in 1858. They started popping up in Belgian towns in 1848 and in London in 1855. Private mailboxes were patented in 1860 by John North, a white guy, of Middleton, Connecticut. Next, the traffic signal. Invented by Garrett A. Morgan in 1932. Nope. Garrett Morgan had a cross-shaped crank-operated traffic signal and was not among the first 50 patented traffic signals, nor was it automatic, as is sometimes claimed, nor did it play any part in the evolution of the modern traffic light. Third, the elevator. Invented by Alexander Mills in 1887. Nope. Steam-powered hoisting devices were used in England by 1800. Elisha Graves Otis's 1853 safety elevator prevented the car from falling if the cable broke, and thus paved the way for the first commercial passenger elevator installed in New York City's Hugh Wout department store in 1857. The first electric elevator appeared in Mannheim, Germany in 1880, built by the German firm Siemens & Halske. And a self-closing shaft door was invented by J.W. Meeker in 1874. Next, blood plasma separation. Did Charles Drew discover that blood plasma could be separated and stored from the rest of the body, as heavy traffic ahead likes to say? No. The possibility of using blood plasma for transfusion purposes was known at least since 1918, when English physician Gordon R. Ward suggested it in a medical journal. In the mid-1930s, John Elliott advanced the idea, emphasizing plasma's advantages in shelf life and donor recipients' compatibility. And in 1939, he and two colleagues reported having stored plasma in 191 transfusions. Next, the air conditioner, invented by Frederick Jones in 1949. Nope, Dr. Willis Carrier built the first machine to control both the temperature and humidity of indoor air. He received the first of many patents in 1906. In 1911, he published the formulae that became the scientific basis for air conditioning design. And 4 years later, he formed the Carrier Engineering Corporation to develop and manufacture AC systems. Next, the lawnmower, invented by John Burr in 1899. Nope. English engineer Edwin Budding invented the first real-type lawnmower with blades arranged in a cylindrical pattern, and had it patented in England in 1830. In 1868, the United States issued patent number 73,807 to Amariah M. Hills of Connecticut, who went on to establish the Archimedean Lawnmower Company in 1871. By 1888, the U.S. Patent Office had granted 138 patents for lawnmowers. Doubtlessly, there were even more by the time Burr got his patent in 1899. The point of this is not to dump on black people or say they can't invent anything, but to point to a rather brazen example of an egalitarian/black nationalist organization lying in such a transparent and verifiable way. Imagine if a white nationalist organization, or even a white nationalist YouTube vlogger, said something as transparently false as these black invention myths. We would never hear the end of it. The fact that black invention myths have been able to stand is just a very large example of this double standard. Next, let's go on to hate crime hoaxes. Yes. The most notable hate crime hoax that people know of is the Duke lacrosse case, where a stripper accused some lacrosse players of raping her, some white lacrosse players of raping her, and I think she accused them of like racial epithets and stuff. Anyway, they were found innocent, and this stripper went off to go murder someone later on. But what was significant about all of this was that a group of 88 professors at Duke signed a statement condemning the lacrosse players, assuming their guilt, and then refused to recant a single word of it when the lacrosse players were found to be innocent. No apology, no recanting, just stonewall. We can also look at the UC San Diego incident where a black student hung a noose in the library, and this event sparked outrage and even condemnation from the governor at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and when the perpetrator revealed himself as a black person, it was all quietly swept under the rug. There's also an example of a black Port Authority worker lynching some black dolls and trying to make it look like she was being intimidated. Well, she was found out and she was fired. Linked in the description are a bunch of other hate crime hoaxes. Now, in examining hate crime laws, what one must realize is that Hispanics are treated as a victim category, but not as a perpetrator category. So let's say Pedro attacks a black person, and this attack is racially motivated. That act is treated as a white on black hate crime. Pedro is treated as white because Hispanic is not a perpetrator category. But if Pedro attacks a white person, that's not treated as a hate crime, since Pedro is, in this instance, treated as white, even if it is racially motivated, because obviously Amerindians and whites are not the same race. So even if it's racially motivated, in the statistics, it'll be viewed as a white-on-white violent crime. But if that same white person attacks Pedro, and the attack is racially motivated, then that's treated as a white-on-Hispanic crime. I'm not making this up. Sources are in the description. So we know of hate crime hoaxes, but there's also the other side of obvious anti-white hate crimes not being reported as such. There's an example of 4 black Marines tying up their white sergeant and his wife and shooting them execution style with racial epithets scrawled across the wall, but that was not called a hate crime. There's also the example of the Marshall family being attacked at a park while they were watching fireworks by 50, count them, 50 black teenagers. There was no incident that led to this attack, but as the black teenagers approached the Marshall family, they were saying, "This is our world," and "This is a black world," which arguably they may be right about. The attack was not called a hate crime, but we don't hear about this. What do we hear about? We hear about the Duke lacrosse player. So though we have heard a little bit about flash mobbing, and we have heard a little bit about the Iowa State Fair thing, so I guess the situation may be improving, but it's still, the media still doesn't, I think, quite do justice to how big the disparity is in terms of actual hate crimes. And hate crime hoaxes should be viewed within the context of the term racism being used quite liberally. The term racist does not clarify, since there are so many definitions of the term racist, right? Racist could mean that you think the races are of different intelligence, or that you want to kill all black people, right? Both of those people are labeled racist, so the spectrum is so broad as to be worthless. And so anyone using the term racist is doing so not to clarify or properly define someone's beliefs, but as a slur. And we all know this. And the real motives of all this become crystal clear when the Southern Poverty Law Center calls the Taxed Enough Already Party, or the Tea Party, and the Constitution Party racist. The lynching myth. Let's talk about lynching. From Richard M. Perloff, professor of communications at Cleveland State University, quote, "Approximately 4,742 individuals were lynched between 1882 and 1968. Of the victims, 3,445, or 73% of them, were black." Now, if we recognize that lynching was a way violent crime was dealt with in rural southern areas, then we can compare it to modern incarceration rates. There were 16,227 perpetrators of murder and non-negligible homicide reported by law enforcement agencies to the FBI in 2008. Out of the 11,557 cases in which the race of the perpetrator is known, which are 71%, 5,941 were black. So blacks make up 51.4% of the known perpetrators. There were 2,487 arrests for rape in the U.S. in 2008. 801, or 32.2% of the perpetrators, were black. 65.2% were considered quote-unquote white, though this statistic is useless since Mexicans are lumped in with whites. There were 42,779 arrests for assault in the U.S. in 2008. 14,630, or 34.2% of the perpetrators, were black. Again, 63.3% were quote-unquote white, again worthless since Hispanics are lumped in with the stats. Blacks made up 21,372 of the 56,823 violent crimes, excluding robbery, in 2008, or 37.6% of the U.S. in total. In 2006, blacks made up 13.5% of the U.S. population. Presuming that in the states in which lynchings occurred, the racial demographics were identical to what we now have in the U.S. as a whole, we should expect about 35% to 40% of the lynchings to have involved black people. However, there are a few things to consider. One, there were more blacks as a percentage of the population in the states which had lynchings. If there were twice as many blacks as a percentage of the population in the South than in the country as a whole, then something close to 70% would be expected. And two, there were a few Hispanics between 1882 and 1968 in quote-unquote the South, which means that the whites really were what we would consider whites. And so the white violent crime rate wasn't inflated by conflating Hispanics with whites. So the most reasonable inference is that blacks were not systematically targeted by lynch mobs any more than the current legal system systematically targets blacks. That is, the lynch mobs discriminated based on race no more than the current legal system does. So that begs the question, perhaps the current legal system is viciously racist to precisely the same degree that the old lynch mobs were. Probably not, at least not in terms of violent crime. Because each year, the National Crime Victimization Survey surveys violent crime victims, and each year their reports on the race of the perpetrator match the police report virtually all the time. In fact, it appears as though the police are actually slightly biased in favor of blacks compared to the victims. I'd compare Hispanics too, but Hispanics are conflated with whites in FBI statistics. And as you can see, the police and victim reports are not terribly out of alignment. Moreover, to achieve this degree of correlation, the police and the victim reports would need to somehow correlate. They would have to somehow correspond with each other. They'd have to conspire with each other to make sure that they were giving the same answers. So the rational and obvious conclusion is that, contrary to Family Guy mythology and contrary to egalitarian, the kind of egalitarian and civil rights narrative, blacks are not unfairly targeted as perpetrators of violent crimes. Nor does it appear that they were systematically targeted by lynch mobs once this is recognized as the standard. The Civil Rights Memorial acknowledges 40 people who died trying to advance civil rights between the years 1954 and 1968. That is a period of 14 years. In 2009, there were 454 black on white murders and 209 white on black murders. But unfortunately, we know what this means, right? The white on black murders is also Hispanic on black murders. Anyway, which means blacks murdered about 245 more people on net, probably a little more if we assume the reported data is representative of the unreported murders where the race of the perpetrator is unknown. But if we just go with 245, right, with all the problems with that, that's still 6 times as many people as were killed for advocating civil rights in a single year. All right, enough about America. Let's look at South Africa. In 1900, there were roughly 3.5 million blacks in South Africa, 8.5 million blacks in 1954, and 35 million blacks in 1990. In 1948, when apartheid was introduced as official policy, the life expectancy of blacks in South Africa was 38 years. In 1994, it had risen to 64 years. As of August 10, after 16 years of ANC and black rule, it had fallen to 49 years, which is a little less than a fall of 1 year per year. One should also recognize that when Europeans arrived, what is modern-day South Africa was practically empty. In fact, most of the continent of Africa was empty. The population density was very low and disorganized. So the idea that the Europeans were coming in and taking their land is kind of misleading since it was mostly empty. Anyway, the closest large population of native Africans at the time were the Zulus, and they numbered maybe 200,000, and they were in the northern parts of South Africa. The overwhelming majority of black South Africans today, well over 90%, descend from people who migrated from further north. They are just as much natives to South Africa as the white Boers are. And these people had to cross very long distances without cars, crossing deserts and avoiding lions in order to have a better life in apartheid South Africa. So it's not like the whites showed up and took their land. The land was empty, and the blacks chose to be second-class citizens in a white-run country than equals in black-run areas. According to the Human Resource Council, 21,000 people died from political violence during apartheid. 14,000 of those died during the revolutionary period between 1990 and 1994, when the ANC came to power. During the period of June 1990 to July 1993, there were 9,325 reported political killings. The South African security forces of the National Party killed 518 people in this time period, or 5.6 of the total political violence. 92% of political violence during this time period was black on black. It was the ANC killing off its black opponents, mainly. The South African police reports that a total of 174,220 people died violent deaths between 1994 and 2000. Interpol, on the other hand, believes this number is closer to 287,000. This is because roughly 1/4 of the South African police force is under criminal investigation for corruption, so it's impossible to tell how bad the situation really is, and people who visit South Africa report a reality that is far worse than what the statistics would paint. In 1991, the white South African population was 5.1 million. However, as of 2007, it's down to 4.2 million, despite the influx of white refugees from other African countries. The South African Institute for Race Relations says that young white men aged 23 to 34 have mostly left the country now, and that there are now many more older white men than younger white men. So people with potential and opportunity are leaving South Africa in droves, right? Which is the opposite of what the ANC promised and what advocates against apartheid predicted. There have been roughly 3,797 confirmed farm murders of whites in South Africa, and roughly 35,000 white farms have been seized and given over to blacks, which has resulted predictably in food shortages in South Africa. And that's actually, the white farm murders, that's actually more than the total number of blacks who were lynched in the U.S. So even if you think that every single lynch was nothing more than a racially motivated hate murder, more whites have been murdered in this way, if you even care about that kind of blood math. Anyway, unemployment has risen in South Africa, going from 24% in 1991 to 48% in 2002.
Do you ever think your life is going to get better, Joseph?
Maybe my life would change if the Nationalist Party came back, not the ANC.
I don't believe you. Come on. That was a white government that put you down, that treated you terribly. You can't really believe that.
But in terms of work, they didn't oppress us. We didn't struggle for work then.
Coloureds make up around 10% of South Africa's population. They tend to be a mixture of Indian, Indonesian and African ancestry. Discriminated against under apartheid, people like Ishmael Reclief say under the ruling African National Congress are still suffering. Are you going to vote in this election?
No.
Why not?
Because what's the use you're going to vote? Most of the people is going to vote for the ANC. I don't know what. They promise you this, they promise you that, nothing happens. I tell you, it's me.
It brings back painful memories, exacerbated by the knowledge that he and other coloureds who fought apartheid are not reaping the benefits.
Are they really there for us? Or are they there for their own interest or money and power?
So you don't feel you've had any benefit from them being in power at all?
No, not at all. Nothing different.
Like many of his countrymen, Ishmael is starting to believe he was better off under apartheid.
The current president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, believes that you can prevent yourself from getting HIV by taking a shower after having sex. Zuma has been accused of raping Fezika Kuzwayo, a deceased friend's daughter, and was known by Zuma to be HIV positive at the time that he raped her. Zuma supporters rallied around the courthouse during the trial, right, and they were yelling insults at the accusers all the time, and in one case they actually stoned a woman who they thought was the Zuma's accuser, the woman who got raped. And wouldn't you know it, Zuma was found to be innocent. Okay, shocking, I know. So that's who the black South Africans elected as their president, a rapist who thinks you can cure AIDS with a shower, and that also gives you some insight into how their court system works. Here's an excerpt from an article, ANC Worse Than Apartheid, Media Freedom Like Zimbabwe. This is worse than anything under apartheid, says Raymond Lau. The powers the government is taking to curb the press are far wider now, and the powers given to the SS minister, the Minister for State Security, are far greater. Mr. Lau is something of a South African institution. He was the news editor of the country's leading anti-apartheid newspaper, the Rand Daily Mail, at the height of apartheid, and then edited the paper for 11 years in the teeth of government hostility. Now 84, he still edits a press digest, Southern African Report, and plays a leading role in the National Editors Forum and the Freedom of Expression Institute. So when he calls the government's recent media laws, quote, the worst attack on press freedom I've seen in my career, he knows whereof he speaks, close quote. So South Africa went from a white supremacist state to a black supremacist state, and we can see what the results of that were. Prior to ending apartheid, the white South Africans were demonized, and supporters of the ANC in the West turned a blind eye to the anti-white racial hatred of the ANC.
Peace, democracy, and love amongst South Africans are fine words in English. But the Xhosa words of the just sung song just don't tally. How does one who speaks Xhosa and English explain away the contradiction between what the people sing from the very depth of their hearts in Xhosa and what is declared or volunteered in English?
So in South Africa today, you have the majority group instituting legal barriers against a minority group. And I haven't even gone into the affirmative action programs in South Africa. The affirmative action programs in South Africa are not like the U.S. Like in the U.S., they tend to be more focused. There are some race-based affirmative action programs, but the welfare, for example, tends to be focused on the poor and just disproportionately helps blacks. In South Africa, there is a Black Economic Empowerment Initiative, which is specifically designed to help poor blacks. Poor whites get nothing.
Isn't black economic empowerment, though, in itself a racist policy?
Why?
Well, because it's about race. The entire policy is race-based.
I don't know. Why don't you look at our constitution?
Well, the very phrase black economic empowerment implies that it's race-based.
No. If affirmative action is not based on socioeconomic conditions, what do you think it's based on?
White people who are poor are not covered under BEE, are they?
What do you understand by socioeconomic conditions?
Well, I'm talking about people living in poverty,
yes.
clearly.
And where's the overwhelming majority of people?
Look, I'm well aware that...
No, I'm asking.
No, I'm well aware that
The ANC, as we can see, allows white South Africans to get targeted in farm murders, and the only thing that is currently protecting white South Africans, or was protecting white South Africans, was the commando system, and that has recently been disbanded by the ANC. And it's also illegal in South Africa for the media to report a murder until you get permission to do so by the police. Okay. The National Party never did anything like this. Immigrants. Okay. The increase in violent crime and welfare caseload that has coincided with bringing in African and Middle Eastern immigrants to Europe, these are all well known. Immigrants in France, for example, make 11% of the population, but non-European immigrants, just non-European immigrants, and their descendants receive 22% of all social benefits. And I would assume similar costs occurring in Britain. We know that rape charges have quadrupled in Sweden in the past 20 years since they started bringing in immigrants. And in Finland, rape was something virtually unheard of, especially gang rape. Not so anymore. It's also been well documented that atheism and social liberalism are correlated with higher IQ. Atheists and social liberals tend to have higher IQs. Also, economic libertarians have higher IQs. So the political group with the highest IQs are atheists, social liberals who advocate free markets. The political group with the lowest IQs are theists, social conservatives who advocate socialism. And this is what I mean when I say National Socialism. It's basically these guys. It's meathead politics. And according to the General Social Survey, one's IQ is a better predictor of how libertarian you will be than any other factor, including education level or income. Blacks, Hispanics, and Middle Easterners tend to have lower IQs, and they tend to advocate these low IQ things. Right? They tend to be theistic and socially conservative and advocate big government. In fact, the Quran says that the Islamic State is sanctioned by God himself. When these people come into Europe, they vote for these policies, which are in full force in the Middle East and Africa, and to a lesser extent in Latin America. A quick glance at the Heritage Foundation's map of economic freedom makes this crystal clear. When Africa was ruled by Europe, they were objectively better off. But democracy has allowed these low IQ peoples to enforce the policies that they want. It has allowed the people's will to manifest in these areas, and the results have been ruinous, predictably ruinous. So far, these groups, when brought into Europe or the United States, behave the way they did in their country of origin, as though it were something genetic. And they vote for economic policies similar to that of Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. The preliminary results are in. I know none of you egalitarians would endorse the farm murders, but you cannot escape the fact that the ANC has egalitarianism at the root of its philosophy. I know they're not doing it how you want it to be done, but I don't care because egalitarian pipe dreams are not reality. It has never turned out the way egalitarians envision. While South Africa is the poster child of the effects of shifting from white to black rule, similar declines in life expectancy occurred all throughout Africa during decolonization. We also know that black violent crime rates as a multiple of white rates are similar in Canada, the UK, and Australia. Wherever these statistics are published, we see the same things, even in countries like Finland, which have no history with blacks and no history of this kind of racial hatred or any animosity or oppression. But the results are the same. We can see what happens to black-run cities in the U.S., like Detroit, St. Louis, and Baltimore, which used to be very fine cities, but no longer. We can also see what happens in Hispanic-run cities like East Los Angeles, El Paso, and Laredo. And what do you know? They're not as bad as Detroit, but they're not as good as suburban white America. Just as Latin and South America are obviously better than Africa, but not quite as good as Europe. And we have Chinatowns all across the US and Canada and Australia, and they're typically known to be nice places, kind of like the urban centers in China, Japan, and South Korea. We can explain these differences very simply by saying that these groups have different innate behavioral traits. Chinatowns are like Northeast Asia because they're full of Northeast Asians. Black-dominated cities are like Africa because they're full of Africans. And Hispanic-dominated cities are like Mexico because they're full of Mexicans. Simple, clean, makes sense of the world. There is no need for an egalitarian theory to explain this. Moreover, cultural theories are so complicated, and they take up entire university departments to construct cultural theories, plural, that explain what is so simply explained by the assumption of genetic differences. Nor should we assume egalitarianism to be some default position should genetics not be proven. All of these things, forced integration, decolonization, mass immigration, affirmative action, were all predicated on the assumption that the populations labeled races are essentially the same in the brain. And so far, all of these policies have failed. And whether or not egalitarian-inspired policies like this can ever work depend on the truth or falsehood of the egalitarian hypothesis. And let's do that. Let's recognize it for what it is, a hypothesis and not an established conclusion. Imagine if there were a group of scientists who said humans could overcome flightlessness by flapping their arms. I would be a bit incredulous, but they're free to try it. They're free to try to prove their hypothesis. All I ask is that they do is that before running us off a cliff and telling us to just fly, that they prove their hypothesis first. So now, a few questions I must pose to the egalitarians. 1. If a white nationalist state formed, and their leader publicly sang a song that said, "Kill the nigger," or "Lynch the nigger," would you spin some nuanced sociological explanation for that? Or would you know exactly what they meant by that? 2. A hypothetical. If, just humor me here, if the blacks in South Africa in general genuinely hated whites, and all of this stuff about being oppressed, while partially true though greatly exaggerated, were just a front for what is primitive race hatred, what would we see? Let's walk through this thought experiment. Well, the South African government can't have killing whites be an official government policy, since that would make them a pariah to the rest of the world. However, they can turn a blind eye to average citizens going around killing whites, for example, the farm murders, and they can dismantle the commando system, and they can reduce the number of police in white areas, and they can take their farms and institute overtly racist policies like black economic empowerment, and they can limit whites' access to firearms, all of which the ANC has done. So humor me. If they hated whites and wanted to kill them all, and if international pressure was all that was keeping them from doing so, what would we see? 3. What would the ANC have to do to convince you that they genuinely hate white people and want to see them all killed? What, besides actually going out and killing them all, would convince you that that's what they wanted to do? What more do they have to do, basically? 4. What people have benefited from allowing in a large portion of African immigrants into their state? Or, I can get more specific and ask, how does letting in black Africans to Finland help the native white Finns? 5. At which anti-racist rally can I get a "Good Night Black Pride" or "Good Night Latino Pride" t-shirt? 6. Where are Coughlin's defenses of Christianity? Or, where can I find an atheist subgroup of similar size to Coughlin's subgroup that defends Christianity from the outside in the same way Coughlin defends Islam from the outside? And 7. Where is the atheist community in the Islamic world? Where on YouTube can I find this community? Now let's go over some basic concepts about how aggregates work, about IQ, about race, and we'll clear out some of the dumber egalitarian arguments before moving on to make the racial hereditarian case. Think of this as clearing the foundation. First, the ecological correlation. Imagine two football teams, the red jerseys and the blue jerseys. The average 40-yard dash time for players of the red jerseys is 4.8 seconds. The average time for players of the blue jerseys is 5 seconds. Now, there is a great deal of overlap between the red jerseys and blue jerseys. There are some fast blue jerseys, and there are some slow red jerseys. There's even another component. Some slow blue jerseys could be better football players than some fast red jerseys, because there's more to football than just 40-yard dash speed. Or, another wrinkle is that some red jerseys could be slower than some blue jerseys, but those slow red jerseys could still be better than the faster blue jerseys because they're just better at football in other ways. Okay? Now, the red and blue jerseys go out and play. In the game, the red jerseys, they always just seem to be half a step ahead, just holistically. Holistically, when watching the game, and it takes a long time, so you have enough time to get this impression, you get an impression that the red jerseys just seem to be a little bit faster than the blue jerseys. Now, football is crazy and messy, and so while I'd give the red jerseys the edge if all I knew was the 40-yard dash times between the teams, this wouldn't be a very confident prediction because there are many other factors at play. But imagine if there were 100 red jersey teams with an average 40-yard dash time of 4.8 seconds and 100 blue jersey teams with an average 40-yard dash time of 5 seconds, and each red jersey team plays another blue jersey team. Over those 100 games, which group of teams is probably going to win more games? The red jersey teams. How about if they played 1,000 games? Well, if that happens, we become even more confident that the red jerseys will win more. How about 1,000,000 games? Even more confident. The higher the number gets, the more confident the prediction is that the red jerseys will win more games because the law of averages begins to take over. IQ is like a 40-yard dash time. It's not the only thing that matters. Work ethic, consistency, and time management may be more important to most individuals. But if you have 1,000,000 people with an average IQ of 85 and 1,000,000 people with an average IQ of 100, the population with an average IQ of 100 will almost certainly earn more, because the statistic that differentiates the populations is not work ethic, consistency, or time management, but IQ, whatever it is that IQ measures. IQ correlates with income at about 0.4 to 0.5, according to Arthur Jensen and Daniel Seligman. And according to a meta-analysis done by Hunter & Hunter in 1984, linked in the description, IQ is a better predictor of job performance than education level, and that education level has little to no predictive power independent of IQ, whereas IQ does have predictive power independent of education. Of course, the best predictor of job performance is past job performance. So, whatever it is that IQ measures, it's something significant. It has real-world consequences. Now, when you control for IQ, the income differences between blacks, whites, and quote-unquote Hispanics virtually go away. Blacks are still a little bit lower than whites, but that could just be a result of blacks living disproportionately in the South and the Deep South relative to whites. And these areas have lower costs of living, and the jobs there tend to pay lower wages. The fact that average income between the races is equalized when average IQ is controlled for not only highlights the importance of IQ, but argues against IQ tests being racially biased. Because if IQ tests are biased against blacks, for example, they're biased precisely to the degree that the rest of society is, which would be quite a coincidence. What's more believable is that neither society nor IQ tests are biased racially, and that IQ tests measure something meaningful that correlates ecologically with income in the same way a 40-yard dash time correlates ecologically with football performance. The test bias charge becomes even more absurd when you know that blacks actually do better on culturally loaded tests than tests designed to be culture fair. Blacks also do better on verbal than nonverbal portions of the tests, which is where one would expect the widest racial gaps if they were indeed a product of cultural or racial bias. But at a more philosophical level, for an IQ test to have any predictive power, it has to be biased in favor of the economic environment in which its test takers will operate. Sure, a hunter-gatherer would probably do quite poorly on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and that IQ test would probably be a very poor predictor of how good a hunter you would be. If an IQ test was completely unbiased, it would be completely useless. So what you want is an IQ test that is biased towards functional ability in the economic environment in question. And the fact that IQ tests predict about as well for any native-born blacks, whites, or Amerindians is evidence that the IQ tests are properly biased towards the economic environment in which these groups operate and are not racially biased. Controlling for socioeconomic status. If you control for IQ, income differences between blacks and whites virtually disappear. that means the inverse is true. If you control for income, IQ differences disappear. Now, what egalitarians like to do is say, see, all you have to do is control for income / socioeconomic status or whatever, and the IQ gap will go away. And, of course, this is true. If you control for income, the IQ gap does go away. And if you control for IQ, the income gap goes away. Hey, people with higher IQs tend to earn more, and they tend to drive nicer cars. If you control for the quality of car, IQ gaps will shrink or go away entirely, right? The general heritability of IQ. The Wikipedia page, which I know a lot of people will bash me for citing Wikipedia, but the Wikipedia page on the heritability of IQ, I think, actually does an excellent job at introducing this topic. Quote, "The study of the heritability of IQ is a field of research that includes biology, genomics, psychology, philosophy, sociology, and anthropology. Heritability is a measure of the relative contribution of genotype to the variation of a phenotype on a given group in a specific environment. But heritability of a trait in a particular population does not set any limits on how malleable the trait is under changes of environment, because, quote, even highly heritable traits can be strongly manipulated by the environment, so heritability has little, if anything, to do with controllability," close quote. The debate about IQ heritability touches on the nature versus nurture divide, and there has been significant controversy in the academic community about it ever since research began in the 19th century. Most of the heritable variance in IQ appears to be carried by the general intelligence factor, or G factor. IQ is a polygenic trait under normal circumstances, according to some researchers. However, destructive mutation of individual genes associated with development can severely affect intelligence, as with phenylketonuria, as an example. Estimates in the academic research of the heritability of IQ within the U.S., they don't say, but that's what they're saying. Estimates in the academic research of the heritability of IQ have varied from below 0.5 to a high of 0.9. A general range of 0.4 to 0.8 was given by, quote-unquote, Mainstream Science on Intelligence, a 1994 declaration of 52 scientists in the field. A 1996 statement by the American Psychological Association gave a 0.45 heritability for children and about 0.75 heritability during and after adolescence. A 2004 meta-analysis of reports in Current Directions in Psychological Science gave an overall estimate of around 0.85 for 18-year-olds and older. The New York Times Magazine has listed about 3/4 as a figure held by the majority of studies. Wonderful, wonderful. Now, just to clarify, when they say a trait is 0.85 heritable, that means genetic similarity to the parent explains 85% of the variation within a population within a particular environment. Okay, and this is important, and let me illustrate why. Let's say you have 100 people and are able to construct perfectly identical environments for them. This, of course, is impossible, but let's just imagine this theoretical construct. In this environment, any variation in IQ in this perfectly identical environment could then be ascribed to genetic differences. It can't be the environmental differences that cause the IQ differences because the environment is exactly the same between all these people. And so in a perfectly controlled environment, heritability would be 1, or would be 100%. That is, genetic differences would explain 100% of the variation between individuals or groups if the environment was perfectly controlled. When they say that IQ is 0.85 heritable, they mean it is 0.85 heritable within the environments that these studies were done, which is the U.S. mainly. Meaning, there are some environmental differences within the U.S., right, between, the ghetto and suburban white America, but these are not very substantial. And, in effect, they're not, is what these studies are showing. In sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, you're dealing with things like malnutrition, early childhood diseases, war, illiteracy, and those things really do impact IQ because environments are so radically disparate in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the heritability within Africa is much lower because there are all these environmental factors that play a role that don't play a role in the U.S. And differences in environment, such as not having enough food and medicine, play a very large role in IQ development. So when they say that heritability of IQ is 0.85 within the U.S., they are restricting the range of analysis to the U.S. Okay? The U.S. is not Africa. The U.S. is not South and Latin America. The U.S. is not South and Central Asia. Okay? Heritability varies from place to place depending on how similar the environments are. Okay? This is not a very complicated concept, but apparently the skeptical heretic couldn't really understand this concept. Hopefully you're smart enough to, even though he was not. In the U.S., where everyone has enough food, everyone has access to books, everyone has access to schools, everyone has access to a certain amount of medicine, the differences in environment account for less of the variation in IQ. Here we have the IQ correlation for a same person taking an IQ test twice. So if you take an IQ test 2 times, your scores are probably going to be a little bit different, right? Because of test taking environment, how energized you were, if you were tired, or if you ate that day, or all sorts of things. So there is some statistical noise in there, and that statistical noise drops it from a correlation of 1 to a correlation of 0.87. Monozygotic twins, or identical twins, reared together, the correlation is 0.86. And monozygotic twins, or identical twins, reared apart, 0.76. Dizygotic, or non-identical twins, reared together, 0.55. We have biological siblings reared together, 0.47. Parents and children living together, 0.4. Parents and children living apart, 0.31. Biological siblings reared apart, 0.24. And adopted children living together, 0 correlation, and unrelated people living apart, of course, 0. It's important to note that there is some random variation in the score, about 0.13, in an individual taking the IQ test. So even if you had 2 completely identical gene sets in completely identical environments, we would only expect an IQ correlation of about 0.87. That's like the upper limit. So what we can do is we can divide each of these correlations by 0.87 to remove that noise, and when we do that, we get a much clearer result. Monozygotic or identical twins reared together, correlation is 0.99, monozygotic twins reared apart, 0.87, dizygotic or non-identical twins reared together, 0.63, biological siblings reared together, 0.54, parents and children living together, 0.46, parents and children living apart, 0.36, and biological siblings reared apart, 0.28. Now, for a sense of how strong and how profound these correlations are, the height of your parents correlates to the height of the child at 0.47. Yes, I'm putting this under basic concepts because the Flynn effect is a simplistic and stupid argument for egalitarianism. The Flynn effect refers to the fact that IQ test scores rise over time and are constantly being renormed. An IQ of 100 in 1950 would translate to an IQ of 85 today. Now, James Flynn himself doesn't call the secular rise in IQ scores over time the Flynn effect, so I don't blame him. He never claimed that this was his own idea, which he shouldn't have, because it wasn't his idea. This fact of rising IQ scores over time was known long before James Flynn started talking about it, which Flynn himself acknowledges. Anyway, the Flynn effect is irrelevant in the same way the secular rise in height is irrelevant. Let's say a woman today would be about as tall as a man in the 1700s was. Given how much height can be affected by nutrition and environment, does this mean that the height gap between men and women is a result of environment today? No. Given how much IQ can be affected by nutrition and environment, see sub-Saharan Africa, see the US 50 years ago, does this mean that the IQ gaps between the various races is a result of environment today? No. Now, the racial gaps could be a result of environment today, but the Flynn effect is not evidence of this. Another thing to note is that the black-white gap has remained remarkably steady. And this is because IQ scores are rank order. A score of 100 is the white average, and let's say white people and black people continually, they genuinely get smarter. What will happen is that the white raw scores on the test will go up. They'll get more correct answers on the IQ test, and the black raw scores on a test will go up. But your IQ score is not the raw score. It's a comparison to other people. And so even if blacks are getting smarter, and so are whites, and so the rank order, the IQ doesn't change. The backbone fallacies of egalitarian argumentation. In dismissing race, the backbone of most egalitarian arguments are two key fallacies, the continuum fallacy and Lewontin's fallacy. The continuum fallacy. The continuum fallacy says that because the races are not clearly divided or discretely defined, the races don't exist because there are some people of ambiguous mixed types. And this is true. You can say the same thing between a tundra and a steppe, a hill and a mountain, a pond and a lake. Now, what sane people do is they either accept the fuzziness and ambiguity of these concepts, or they will construct discrete definitions. They will say, if it's this much volume of water, it's a pond. If it's this much volume of water, it's a lake. If it's this high, it's a hill. If it's this high, it's a mountain. High from what? From sea level? From some other ground level? Right? And they can construct all of these definitions. All right? This is what differentiates a African or a West African from a East African, from a Bantu, from a Middle Easterner, from a European, from an East Asian, or you can break down East Asians further, or from an Amerindian. What kind of Amerindian? Are the Amerindians genetically identical all throughout the Americas? Okay, you can construct all sorts of definitions in the same way you can construct all sorts of definitions between a tundra, a steppe, and a grassland, okay, and plains. You can also talk about feminine and masculine faces. Does the existence of androgynous faces mean that masculine and feminine faces don't exist? Well, we can construct a discrete definition, of facial characteristics with these ratios are masculine. Facial characteristics with these ratios are feminine. What is a chair? Give me a discrete definition of a chair. If you cannot give me a discrete definition of a chair, well, I will simply assume that chairs do not exist. Or I will just say a chair is a social construct. When applied to other situations, the continuum fallacy is absurd. The extreme skepticism applied to race would make egalitarians completely dysfunctional were they not hypocrites in its application. Lewontin's fallacy. There is more genetic variation within the populations labeled races than between them, and a corollary could be that the expressed behavioral traits vary more within the white and black populations than between the averages of those populations. And people say this, and apparently this is supposed to mean something according to egalitarians. Similarly, height and weight varies more within the genders than between the averages of the genders. And I don't know if this is true, but what if it was discovered that behavioral characteristics in terms of aggressiveness, impulsiveness, varied more within the genders than between the genders, or willingness to get in a scuffle or willingness to get in a fight varied more within the genders than between the genders? What does this mean? But what would this mean? I don't know. I really don't know. But when applied to race, apparently this is supposed to mean, I guess, that the averages aren't different because there's more variation within the populations than between them. See, I've never heard the punchline for this argument. Not enough genetic variation. Last is the argument that there's just not enough genetic difference to explain the average differences in IQ between blacks and whites. Of course, there's enough genetic difference among individuals to have people with IQs of 80 and people with IQs of, 120. And there are examples of siblings being significantly more intelligent than the other sibling. Now, do siblings lack the genetic variation needed to explain the IQ differences between siblings? Of course not. Of course not. But the aggregate populations we call black people and white people do not have enough differences for the IQ gap to be a result of genetics, even though these aggregates are more different from each other than individual siblings are from each other. See how this argument works? Okay, egalitarianism kind of makes you stupid. Danielle M. Dick, geneticist from the University School of Medicine in St. Louis, estimates that if one person had all of the quote-unquote good variations of the gene CHRM2 and another had all of the bad variations of the gene CHRM2, the difference would be between 15 and 20 points. Now that's a variation on a single gene. That's a result of allele frequency variations on a single gene. There are roughly 20 to 25,000 genes in the human genome, according to GeneSweep. In January 2011, there was a paper published by Dongdong Wu and Yaping Zhang entitled, quote, Different Levels of Population Differentiation Among Human Genes, and linked in the description to the Biomed Central page, which has the full study. My lack of knowledge of genetics is really hampering me here, but in this, they somehow measured the degree of population differentiation among genes, and they constructed this neat little chart. And the numbers at the top, I think, are some index value for population differentiation among the population sampled. And the populations they sampled were the African, European, and East Asian population data from the HapMap project. And I'll also have a link to the HapMap project so you can see what that is. I don't know if this number is a relative or absolute index of population differentiation, but it doesn't matter, because we can look and see that the genes associated with pigmentation are just about as different among populations as the genes associated with neuron development. And at the top, the genes associated with dorsoventral neural tube patterning and hindbrain development differ among populations much more than pigmentation. So basically, we all know how much skin color differs between the races. Well, Mr. Wu and Mr. Zhang appear to be saying that there was more selective pressure for brain differentiation than skin color differentiation. In other words, genetic causation for these groups labeled races is very, very plausible. We're not talking about creating a whole new species here. We're talking about a few million more cortical neurons. Now, putting genes on the table and saying that it's possible and very plausible that the racial gaps are genetic isn't the same as saying that it definitely is genetic, all right? It's just saying that it's well within the trait space. I'm simply saying that the egalitarian line, that there's just not enough genetic variation, is transparent bullshit. The broad arc of data. To start off, let's look at the broad arc of data. Now, no sample is perfect, so the idea is to take lots and lots of samples, lots and lots of little measures. With Europeans, there are 73 studies I have here, and I'm just going to flash through them quickly. Press the pause button if you would like to see them, or better yet, go read the studies yourself, linked in the description. First are Europeans in Europe. Europeans outside of Europe. Note that these are not the estimated IQs of each country. These are the IQs of people identified as Europeans living in other countries. Next are Africans in Africa. Africans in the Caribbean. Africans in the United States. And Africans in Britain. I didn't graph this one, but blacks in the UK appear to be slightly higher than blacks in the US, and there are a few reasons why this could be. One is that the culture of blacks in the UK is such that they try harder on taking the test. Or it could be that blacks who immigrate to Britain are an elite sample of blacks, whereas blacks in the US are descendants of slaves, and so have a lower population IQ despite the roughly 20% white admixture. Or it could be that either the US samples are systematically biased towards lower scores, or that the British samples are systematically biased towards higher scores, or some mixture of both. Or it could be that blacks do better on the kinds of IQ tests used in Britain than on the kinds of IQ test used in the U.S. There are many reasons this could be, and given the imprecision of global IQ tests, despite its accuracy, I believe, one shouldn't worry about little gaps like this. Here's a chart showing the results of every single study for each racial group presented. Blue is Europeans in Europe, yellow is Europeans abroad, red is Africans in Africa, and green is Africans in the West. The x-axis doesn't mean anything, it's just a placeholder. So, on the one hand, we can see an unmistakable pattern of clustering where many studies are aggregated, but there's also some overlap. This can come from sampling error, measurement error, test-taking conditions, and many other things. Also, this chart is a bit unscientific in the sense that it weighs each study equally. And a country with a lot of studies will be represented more than a country with only a few studies, though countries with large populations tend to have more IQ studies done on them anyway, so this is partially offset by that. I've also noticed that larger studies tend to have more conservative results, whereas smaller studies are the ones which produce these outliers on the chart here. And of course, each outlier is weighed just as much as the studies, the larger studies, which tend to have more conservative results. But all that fuzziness taking into consideration, I still think that this chart gives one a good idea about the relative IQs of each population. The European IQs are a bit lower than 100, and this is definitely a result of including Eastern Europe in the blue line and including Latin America in the yellow line. I would go so far as to say that Africans living in Western Europe have a better environment than the average for white people globally, because that includes Eastern Europe and Latin America. When we look at the incomes of whites in various countries, we see that they're much lower than the median income of blacks in the U.S. In 2009. Now, what's interesting is that according to this data, Hispanics, which are a mixed-race population, earn less than blacks. But, as we will see, they have a higher IQ. And in 1994, Hispanics earned ever so slightly more than blacks when controlling for income. My explanation for this is that there are more recent immigrant Hispanics today than there were in 1994. I don't have any data on black income in the UK, but even if blacks in the UK earned as much as the UK average, it would still put the lie to the idea that blacks in the US are economically deprived, and it's that which causes the IQ gap. Next, let's look at East Asians in East Asia. Now East Asians outside of East Asia. Now, maybe in a different world, we could explore the data further and develop a rich understanding of what kinds of intelligence differences there are, that is, where the genetic differences between races and subpopulations within races manifest, using single studies and bits of data to piece together a coherent theory, just like we would with any other topic. But that's not the world today. The world today is full of egalitarians who will scour anything a hereditarian says, getting in the way of genuine exploration and forcing us instead to battle through selective skepticism and their tenacious clinging to any plausible environmental argument. And so, it has to get ugly, and I have to spend all this time demonstrating the many ways in which we know that blacks are innately less intelligent than whites. It's remedial. As an addendum to the previous section, I think it's necessary to point out that people use words and concepts that cannot be defined discretely. Define grandeur, define great, define good, define evil, define chair, define masculine, define feminine, define force, define car, define truck. What does a car look like? What does a truck look like? When do you go from calling something a car to calling something a truck? Define intelligence. We can't define intelligence, well then intelligence simply doesn't exist. We have a pragmatic, field contextual understanding of what a car and what a truck is. even though most have no discrete definition of the two. They could construct a definition of the two. They could construct certain ratios of the bed or whatever, but that's simply a construction. I mean, the notion of a car and a truck precedes any constructed definition, any discrete definition that is then created. Any definition of a car and a truck would be created after the fact. Similarly, we have a pragmatic field contextual definition of race and a pragmatic field contextual definition of intelligence. With race, this whole discussion only becomes an issue with individuals of ambiguous mixed types, and most of them can be identified as mixed types, and we can say they're 50% black, 50% white European, or whatever. With intelligence, it can be a little bit fuzzier, which is why I stick with IQ, since that's more objective than some intelligence. Although I believe the general intelligence factor measures what we would call intelligence, but that's a whole different issue, and I don't even get into that in this presentation. I believe that IQ is an intelligence test in the same way a football combine is a football skill test. Of course, no test is perfect, but IQ tests predict real-life performances better than education level. Let's review what we've done so far. 1. We've demonstrated that the egalitarian consensus on race and the egalitarian consensus on intelligence is a chimera, and views of those things in reality, they vary depending on discipline and depending on country. The phony egalitarian consensus is more of a talking point than an actual argument anyway. 2. We showed that the definition of race varies and that population geneticists use other words to describe race, and that their population groups correspond almost perfectly with the classical racial categories. 3. We showed that IQ is highly valid in terms of real-world outcomes, especially when comparing groups. 4. We showed that within-group heritability of IQ is very high, especially in what are called first-world countries. 5. We showed that there is plenty of genetic variation between the races, more than enough to account for behavioral differences, and specifically in regards to brain development. And 6. We illustrated many of the disasters of egalitarian policies and a few documented incidences of egalitarian fraud in the form of Gould, Boas, and the black invention myths, and the hysterical reactions to hate crime hoaxes. I wouldn't call that a fraud, since one's reaction cannot be fraudulent, but that's more of an example of the sickness of this. This is evidence that egalitarianism is neither benign nor is it always rational. The backswing complete, now let's get into race proper. Seeing the migration out of Africa, we should recognize hereditarianism as the default hypothesis. We can compare two different animals and see differences in behavior in the wild, and when we do, we assume that genes are the cause. When we compare two different populations of dogs, we assume their behavioral differences are a result of genetics. Now, here I have found two sources which measure the genetic distance between human races and the genetic distance between dog breeds, linked in the description. From what was posted there, among breeds of domesticated dogs, 35% of the variation is between breeds and 65% is within breeds. For humans, 13.5% of the variation is between races and 86.5% is within races. Or to break it down further, human races are 38.5% as different from each other as breeds of domesticated dogs are. Previously, I have stated that human races were more genetically distant from each other than dog breeds are, and I was mistaken. However, genetic distances between human races, we could say, is on the same scale as distances between breeds of dogs. And if you're talking about breeds of dogs that are close to each other, we may be able to say that some human races are more distant from each other than some widely recognized breeds of dogs are from each other. And so, for those dog breeds who are closer genetically than, say, East Asians are to black Africans, we could say that the race denialists would also have to deny the existence of some of the more well-known breeds in some of those divisions. Of course they won't, and they don't, The ridiculous standards erected for classifying breeds of humans is never applied to anything else. Now, different dogs evolve in different environments, and perhaps the parenting environment of different breeds of dogs is different. So, if you raised a pit bull with some golden retrievers, you're not going to get an animal that behaves like a golden retriever, but it may not behave quite like a pit bull either. Blacks in Africa behave much differently than whites in Europe. If you raised a black African among Europeans, he won't be quite like a black African, but we know from just experience, he won't be quite like a white person either. With all other animals, we recognize that offspring rearing strategies co-evolved with all other behavioral traits. So it could be that the parenting strategies of one race hold their children back, but this parenting strategy could itself be a product of genetics. So even apparent environmental differences like this could be genetic in origin in a roundabout way. Now, maybe this analogy here that I'm making with breeds of dogs is overly simplistic. Humans are, after all, quite different from other animals. But the point here is that, like with breeds of dogs, the behavioral differences between breeds of humans should be assumed to be genetic until environmental causation is substantiated, because we are still animals after all. Now let's look up myopia. Myopia, or nearsightedness, is a known hereditary condition, meaning that you inherit it. And this is known, this is not debated. Okay. Myopia is also associated with a higher nonverbal IQ. People with higher nonverbal IQs are more likely to have nearsightedness, hence the stereotype of the egghead engineer with glasses. Let me quote from a paper from the Journal of Investigated Ophthalmology and Visual Science entitled, quote, IQ and the Association with Myopia in Children. Quote, controlling for the same factors, children with higher nonverbal IQ scores had significantly more myopic refractions. ... Nonverbal IQ accounted for a greater proportion of the variance in refraction compared with books read per week. And to the conclusion they said, quote, verbal IQ may be an independent risk factor for myopia, and this relationship may not be explained merely by increased reading books per week among myopes. An interesting observation is that nonverbal IQ may be a stronger risk factor for myopia compared with books read per week. The complexity of the relationships between nonverbal IQ, reading, and myopia warrant additional studies to clarify any cause-effect relationship. Now that's good conservative science. My belief is that families with a high prevalence of myopia will read to their kids more than families that don't have a high prevalence of myopia. And this creates the illusion that it's the reading of books that causes the myopia, and that nonverbal IQ is a stronger predictor of myopia, a stronger predictor than how many books you were read to as a kid. That, to me, supports the genetic hypothesis. Now, wouldn't you know it, myopia varies by race. Yes. From Douglas Frederick from the British Medical Journal, quote, additional evidence supporting the role of genetics in the development of myopia includes the wide variability of the prevalence of myopia in different ethnic groups. The prevalence of myopia in Asia is as high as 70 to 90%, in Europe and America 30 to 40%, and in Africa 10 to 20%. Not sure what he means by Asia, but if he means Northeast Asians, that would make sense, as Northeast Asians have a very high nonverbal IQ compared to Europeans, which is seen whenever IQ scores are broken down, or the SAT is broken down. There has been considerable debate over whether the relatively low East Asian verbal IQ is a result of genetics or environment. And with East Asians, there's actually kind of a plausible environmental explanation, since East Asian languages are radically different from European languages, and there may be a multi-generational effect of having to learn a language that's as different, going from, say, Chinese or Japanese to English. In that if this impairment, and that this impairment is multi-generational, and that if this impairment didn't exist, the East Asian IQ would be closer to 115 instead of what it is now, which is like 105. But this prevalence of myopia among East Asians is evidence that the difference in pattern of intelligence between Europeans and East Asians, that this is this pattern difference is genetic in origin. Also, blacks score relatively higher on verbal than nonverbal portions of SAT and IQ tests, and whites score a little bit higher on nonverbal than verbal portions. So the pattern of IQ scores between the races corresponds to the rates of myopia between them, and this is inferential evidence that the pattern differences of IQ and SAT scores, and as stated before, SAT correlates to IQ scores at 0.81, which is very close to the random variation of taking an IQ test twice at 0.87. All this is inferential evidence that the pattern differences are genetic in origin. Gene amplification. Let's look at embryos of various species. What you'll notice is how similar they are early in development. But by the second stage, the fish of an unnamed species and the salamander have lengthened out a little bit. In the second stage, there is similarity between the rest, but the tortoise and the chicken are starting to look a bit different from the other mammals. The mammals are still virtually indistinguishable by phase 2. By phase 3, the chicken and the tortoise have clearly broken off, but the rest of the mammals are still quite similar. I mean, you can tell them apart, but they're kind of similar. And you can see the relatively larger brains in the mammals, especially in the human. Now, given how similar all these animals were in the first stage, should we assume that it's environmental differences that cause one embryo to become a chicken and one embryo to become a rabbit? Because look, they were all the same in stage 1. As these animals develop, they start to diverge more and more, as though their paths were genetically programmed and they end up diverging. Chimpanzees and great apes. You can find early parity between apes and humans. Sometimes the apes will perform better than humans on certain tasks.
Professor Tetsuro Matsuzawa at the Kyoto Primate Research Institute in Japan has devised a memory test for the chimpanzees. His star pupil is a 7-year-old chimpanzee. Show him the numbers 1 to 9 and he'll put them in the right order, pointing to them one by one. Every time he gets it right, he receives a treat, a tiny piece of apple or half a raisin. But now, the researchers make things difficult. As soon as the chimp presses the number 1, the rest of the numbers are hidden. He has to remember where the numbers were and press the white squares in numerical order. The positioning of the numbers is totally random. He gets it right time after time, with lightning speed and 100% accuracy.
In 0.65 seconds, he can remember the numerals in which position.
Now it's your turn. Did you get them? No? Try again. This time we'll run the sequence at half speed. Still too difficult? Try at a quarter speed. Back to full speed, and you get an idea of how extraordinary this chimpanzee's memory is. So how do humans compare? No one knows why, but children tend to be better than adults at this sort of short-term memory task. We've asked some 9-year-olds to have a go. They take a lot longer studying the numbers before they start. And even then, most of the time, they only get 4 or 5 right. Occasionally, they do a little better. Not bad. But now watch the chimpanzee again. It seems that chimp short-term memory is superior to ours.
What's this? Pipe what? What's this? What is that? Pipe what? Pipe food. I guess pipe tobacco is sort of a pipe food, for pipes anyway. They'll take signs, separate signs in their vocabulary, and recombine them in a novel fashion. For example, calling a watermelon, because they don't have the signs for water or melon. One Champlusi called it a candy drink, or a drink fruit, which means that they're not treating their signs as inviolate wholes, or the messages as inviolate wholes, but they're novelly recombining them.
Look. Hold him. You're going to? Yes. Oh, Coco, look. Yes, birds. Aren't they cute? They're cute. They're cute birds. And, oh, Coco, a baby cat. See? Coco? No, cat. Yes, he looks like it is a tiger. You're right. That is a tiger. Now, this is your medicine. Okay.
She was 1 year old when I began the study, and her early acquisition of signs was quite slow. She learned about 1 per month for the first 18 months, and then following that, her rate of acquisition accelerated, and in the next year she had acquired 100 signs. The year following that, she again doubled and was up to about 250. Now, this compares quite favorably with a child learning language in the early stages. Between their second and third years, a child may learn anywhere from 50 to 400 words.
So we see some parity, but we all know that by adulthood, the human is far past the ape. That is, the ape may be roughly equal in childhood, probably with a different pattern of intelligence than a human. But he then remains a child, and he doesn't go far past that. We all know of people who were blondes and redheads as little kids, and then when they got older, their hair will turn brown or even black. Also, IQ becomes more, not less, heritable as you get older. We also know that physical and behavioral differences between boys and girls become much more profound during puberty. Okay, so what's the point of all of this? Well, the black-white IQ gap widens with age. The egalitarian explanation for this is compounding environmental effects. Okay, the idea is that the effects of the worst black environment, they compound over time, right? They have a worse environment at childhood. This results in them not being able to develop their brain as much later on, and so these environmental effects compound over time, resulting in the IQ gap widening. And the hereditarian explanation of this is that genes simply become more expressed over time. From Rushton and Jensen's paper, 30 Years of Research on Race Differences in Cognitive Ability, quote, "The average correlation of IQ between full siblings reared together reaches 0.49 in adulthood. The correlation of IQ for siblings reared apart as children is 0.24, which increases to 0.49 in adulthood, the same as siblings reared together in adulthood. This shows that siblings grow more similar to each other as they age. In genetically unrelated people reared together, such as adopted children, the correlation for IQ is 0.25 in childhood, but decreases to 0.01 in adulthood. This shows conversely that unrelated people reared together grow less similar over time." This chart shows shared environment, unshared environment, and genetic estimates for the determination of IQ within the U.S. Shared environment is the environment that both siblings in a household have, and this is also known as passive environment. This is the environment that is imposed upon the child. Unshared environment is the environment that the child creates for itself. For example, a child who loves math will seek out math knowledge and take math classes and get math books and things like that. Or if he's into science or biology, he'll ask his parents for a chemistry set and he'll develop his faculties in that subject. And so active environment or non-shared environment is where the child has a genetic predisposition to something, and because of that predisposition, the child creates an environment for himself that enhances that which it was already genetically predisposed to. And of course, genetics is just that. By adulthood, the effects of shared or imposed environment or passive environment fall to virtually zero within the U.S. Now, this creates another wrinkle in terms of the racial IQ gaps, because even if you could show that the black-white IQ gap is partially a result of environmental differences within the U.S., that environmental gap could be a result of active environment. That is, it's not a result of the environment that is imposed upon black and white children, but is a result of the environments that the black and white children create for themselves. And of course, it's true that everything is environmental and genetic. For example, by feeding both a rabbit and a dog, you are controlling their environment in terms of what you feed them. However, if you fed both of them vegetables, the rabbit would probably be fine, but the dog would probably get sick and get malnutrition. So, in that sense, even if you control the environment, the same environment may have different effects on different animals. So, when we're comparing races of humans, we are assuming that the races are similar enough that similar environments will have similar effects. Black children in the U.S. do have a worse intellectual environment than whites in the U.S. This is empirical. Like, this is not really disputable. However, I do not believe that this gap in childhood environment is a result of economic limitations among blacks, and nor do egalitarians anymore. Nor do egalitarians who actually research this topic. And let me provide 3 studies that is evidence of that. First is Tizard's orphanage study, which shows the IQs of black, mulatto, and white children in orphanages in the UK, with blacks having the highest IQ at 108, mulattoes at 106 and whites at 103, I believe. The sample of the study had only 30 children, but this is evidence that at this age, black children are ahead of whites developmentally, with mulattoes in the middle, as you would expect, because they're a hybrid. Their development trajectory is going to be intermediate. In the Eliza Moore adoption study, which included 46 black and mulatto children, there were 23 that were placed in white families and 23 that were placed in black families. Now, the children put in white families had an IQ of 117 between ages 7 and 10, and the children put in black families had an IQ of 104 between the ages of 7 and 10. Now, these IQs between both groups are so high that this obviously is not a representative sample of blacks and mulattoes across the U.S., but it does show a 13-point gap for 7 and 10-year-olds depending on the race of the parent. Moreover, the adoption study controlled for the socioeconomic status of the adopting families. All right? So these are middle-class black families and middle-class white families. So even when you control for economics, the white families, being raised by a white family raises your IQ more. Right? So this is evidence that the parental environment, or the childhood environment disparity between blacks and whites is not a result of the economic differences. Then there was the Willerman study, and in it, the mixed-race children in the study had a median IQ of 98. The white children had an IQ of 105, and the black children IQ of 91. This was between the ages of 7 and 10, and that's not really interesting. That's just, yeah. But what is interesting is that of the interracial children, those with a black mother had an IQ of 93, while the interracial children with a white mother had an IQ of 102. And this study followed approximately 42,000 children. Now, all this is evidence that white families tend to raise the IQs of children at those ages, right? Whereas black families or black parents do not. Okay, now the black-white IQ gap widens with age. And according to James Flynn, the black-white IQ gap is 4.65 points at age 4, 9.45 points at age 12, 13.05 by age 18, and 16.5 by age 24. Okay, and James Flynn is, I would consider, an egalitarian. According to Arthur Jensen, who I would consider a hereditarian, it's 10.5 points in early childhood. I don't know specifically what ages that is, but it's not that important. 15 points in middle childhood, and 18 points by early adulthood. So Jensen appears to think the gap's a little bit wider than Flynn, but it's not that much wider. Now, given the results of the Tizard study, and given how it's well established that blacks develop faster than whites, and this is what Rushton showed in black babies walking earlier, going into puberty earlier, it is my belief that the brain development curves for blacks and whites go something like this. Now, I don't know exactly where they intersect, when it is that whites become innately developmentally ahead of blacks, but somewhere between 7 years and 12 years would be my guess. Now, we know that whites are ahead of blacks in IQ far earlier than that in practice, right? And I believe that is because of environment. Because as seen prior, environment plays a much bigger role in young children than it does in adults. To put it another way, by enriching a child's environment, you can raise that child's IQ up to his genetic potential, but then you kind of hit a wall, and it's very difficult to make IQ gains beyond that, at least with what we know now. And early on, whites are ahead of blacks because because white parents provide an enriching environment. Even though innately, and this is what the minimal evidence I have shows, innately they could be merely the equals of black children at that age, or, I believe, developmentally behind. Now, let me recap, because this theory I presented here is a little bit nuanced. My theory is that innately, blacks are ahead of whites until about age 9, would be my guess. After age 9, whites become innately more intelligent than blacks, as proxied by IQ tests, and this innate gap widens until age 24, when the brain has finished myelinating. However, whites have better environments in early childhood, since white parents invest more time in educating their children. And as the Moore adoption study showed, this has nothing to do with economics. I believe that this is an innate aggregate difference in child-rearing strategies between blacks and whites, and this, along with the larger Negro genitalia, is part of what Rushton's theory was talking about when he was talking about the races having different innate reproductive strategies, right? The R and the K type. And you can go read Rushton's Race, Evolution, and Behavior if you want to read about that. I think that what he says about that is kind of problematic. I don't know why people are getting in such a tizzy about it. I mean, it's just, biology. These populations breed in this way, these populations breed in this way. I mean, if he were talking about, different breeds of pigs, they would have no problem with what he was doing. But since humans are special. Anyway, I'm digressing. Now we can have an evolutionary theory of this, right? Whites, having lived in a harsher climate than Africans, they had fewer children. And because of the environment, they had to take much better care of their children because the environment was harsher. You leave your kid out in the cold, the kid's going to die. Also, given that there was less food in these colder climates back then, white children would develop a little bit slower than black children, right? Because there was a little bit less food, there was a little bit less surplus to raise a kid. So there's a plausible evolutionary explanation for all of this. It's plausible but not proven. Because of better environments that white parents provide, the black-white IQ gap manifests earlier than age 9. However, if you control for environment before age 9, as occurred in the Tizard orphanage study, the black-white IQ gap goes away. And in the Moore adoption study, the blacks and mulattoes were reported to have virtually identical IQs. And according to my hypothesis, mulattoes should be intermediate on this development range, and the Moore adoption study must have tested the children at the range at which the black and mulatto cognitive development curves intersect. It's a bit complex, but if you recognize that 1, the races have different development curves, and 2, environment plays a bigger role in children, and the effects of environment fade out in adulthood, and 3, genes get more expressed as you get older, you will find that the hereditarian hypothesis can explain all the results of Tizard, Moore, and Willerman just fine, and in fact, all of this evidence taken together points to strongly to a genetic hypothesis. I would shudder at an egalitarian trying to explain this with only cultural theories, basically depriving himself of genes as any explanation for this pattern of data that we see. The G factor. On an IQ test, some subtests are more heritable than others. Now, if the racial gaps were primarily a result of environment, we would expect to find the racial gaps to be widest on those subtests which can be trained the most. That is, the subtests with the highest environmentality. If racial gaps were a result of genetics, one would expect to find the racial gaps to be widest on those subtests which are most influenced by genetic factors. And hey, guess what? The racial gaps are widest on those subtests with the highest genetic component. Charles Spearman came up with the concept of the general intelligence factor, or the G factor. Spearman saw that children's grades vary across subjects, seem to correlate. That is, if you did well in math, you also seem to do okay in history as well. And hypothesized that there was an underlying general intelligence factor. And while intelligence could be specific to a topic or to a task, there also seemed to be an underlying general intelligence. And so in an IQ test, the test which best correlates with all the other tests is said to have the highest G loading, as high performance on that test is most likely to predict high performance on other cognitive tasks. What does this have to do with subtest heritability? Well, according to Rushton and Jensen in their 2009 paper, the rise and fall of the Flynn effect as a reason to expect a narrowing of the black-white IQ gap, they say, quote, moreover, heritabilities calculated from twin studies correlate with the G loadings, to correlation of 0.99 for the estimated true correlation, provide biological evidence for a true genetic G as opposed to a mere statistical G. And what they did is they took identical twins reared apart, gave them IQ tests, and found that the differences in IQ between the twins reared apart was almost entirely on non-G-loaded subjects, and that the gaps between the identical twins inversely correlated almost perfectly with the G loadings. Note they say 0.99 as an estimated true correlation. And remember, this is because an IQ test only correlates with itself at 0.87. If you take an IQ test twice, the correlation tends to be 0.87. So the correlation that they found the inverse correlation that they found between the G loading and the gap was probably 0.86, which they divided by 0.87 to find the estimated true correlation of 0.99. In the real world, what this means is that the underlying general intelligence in people is mainly genetic, at least within the range of environments analyzed here. G loading and subtest heritability are, for all intents and purposes, the same thing. G might as well stand for genetic. From Rushton and Jensen's paper, 30 Years of Research on Race Differences in Cognitive Ability, quote, subsequently, Nyborg and Jensen analyzed a unique battery of 19 highly diverse cognitive tests from an archival dataset of 4,462 males who had served in the U.S. Armed Forces. The G factor was extracted using different methods. Spearman's hypothesis was confirmed with an average correlation of 0.81 between the race differences on a test and its G loading. So what should we do? Well, we divide 0.81 by 0.87, and that gives us an estimated true correlation of 0.93, meaning that the G factor, which is virtually the same as subtest heritability, explains 86% of the variation between blacks and whites in the U.S. Army sample that they used. Let's compare this to South Africa. 3 tests have found a correlation between the G loading and the black-white IQ gap in South Africa of 0.61, 0.77, 0.70, and 0.81. And this average is out to just over 0.72, which is lower than the U.S. But if we divide that by 0.87, 0.72 divided by 0.87 is 0.83. And that squared is 0.69. So 69% of the variation between blacks and whites in the South African samples they used is probably a result of genetics. Now, I am going to say something very radical here. And this position is not publicly held by Rushton, Jensen, Murray, or any of the other big hereditarians, though I personally believe that they hold this view in secret. I believe that the black-white IQ gap in the U.S. is completely 100% a result of genetics, either directly or indirectly. We know that it's about 86% genetics straight up just from the factor analysis of the Army sample. We further know that the effects of shared environment go to 0 by age 24. But even if the effects of shared environment remained, the environmental disparity between blacks and whites in childhood is not a result of economic disparity, but a result of, in my estimation, innate differences in child-rearing modes, which stem from genetic differences between the races. And any difference in non-shared environment or active environment, that of course is a result of the genetic predispositions of the child, right? The child with a genetic predisposition to a certain topic is going to pursue that topic and raise their IQ in that area. Okay. So I would say that the US black-white IQ gap is 86% directly genetic and 14% indirectly genetic by age 24. Now, if you can understand it, the G factor is far and away the most powerful argument in the hereditarian arsenal. The egalitarian hypothesis would predict the exact opposite of what is found by looking at the G factor. But wait, there's more. Regression to the mean. This extremely high genetic estimate that I put forward is corroborated with regression to the mean. Now, in horse racing, the best performers on the track become studs, and they are bred with the female offspring of other studs. A fast mother and a fast father create fast offspring, of course, but the offspring is usually not quite as fast as its parents were. I'm not a geneticist, so take this with a grain of salt. While you inherit your genes from your parents, you don't get identical combinations, which is why you don't look identical to your parents. And so, if your mom and dad are great athletes, you'll probably be merely a good athlete. And all of this is probabilistic. And this is true at the other end. If your parents are poor athletes compared to the rest of the population, the breeding population, then their offspring will probably be poor athletes too, but not quite as bad as they were. But this then begs the question, what is a population? Do horse offspring regress to the mean of all animal life on the planet? Of course not. For example, in the 100-meter dash, despite regression to the mean, blacks are still faster than whites after all these years. And the gap, the black-white 100-meter dash gap, as far as I know, is not narrowing. So it appears that blacks and whites are regressing to different population means in terms of 100-meter dash speed. Because if they regressed to the same breeding population mean, then eventually black and white 100-meter dash times would equalize. What if IQ were heritable and regressed to racial means in the same way 100-meter dash time was heritable and regressed to racial means? Well, we would expect parents with very high IQs to have offspring with IQs that regress to their racial mean. And wouldn't you know it, surprise, surprise, that's what we see. Rushton and Jensen talk about parent-to-offspring regression to the mean and assert that that is the case, but the better evidence is with siblings. Not only because there's more of it, but because siblings were raised in similar environments. And so the differences can't be chalked up to shared or passive environmental differences. And now this chart here is from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth done in 1999, which involved 12,686 participants aged 14 to 21. Now, if a black sibling has an IQ of 100, the other sibling should regress toward 85, which is the U.S. black average, and the hereditarian would predict an IQ score of 92 or 93. The egalitarian would predict 100, right? Now here's that data charted. I don't feel the need to read you the data. You can click on the links and read it to yourself. It's on page 12 of one of the sources. Basically, you can see when the white sibling has an IQ of 100, the other sibling also has an IQ on average of about 100. While when a black sibling has an IQ of 100, their sibling regresses down toward 92 or 93, which is between 85 and 100. When a white sibling has an IQ of 80, the other sibling regresses up to 90. Whereas when a black sibling has an IQ of 80, the other black sibling only regresses up to 85, so their IQ is between 82 and 83. The egalitarian has no compelling explanation for regression to the mean. The strength of regression to the mean we see here is evidence that the black-white IQ gap is almost entirely genetic. Since if it was partially environmental, we would see only partial regressions to the mean. But looking at this data here, we see almost entire intermediate results intermediate from outlier siblings. Brain size. First, brain size matters. Researchers at the University of Virginia conducted a meta-analysis of 37 studies involving 1,530 people and found a correlation between brain size and adult female IQ of 0.41 and a correlation between brain size and adult male IQ of 0.38. Now you may scoff at how low that correlation is, but for some perspective, the correlation between muscle mass and strength in the arm is only 0.23. So the correlation between brain size and IQ is higher than the correlation between arm muscle mass and arm strength. Okay. Also, three things to keep in mind. One, the correlation between taking an IQ test twice is 0.87, because, as said before, there is some variation with an individual taking an IQ test. So when you divide so when you divide by that, by 0.87, these correlations, divide 0.41 by 0.87, the female correlation increases to 0.47, and the male correlation increases to 0.44. 2. Total brain size isn't everything in terms of intelligence. There is evidence that specific parts of the brain are more important in terms of creating what we call intelligence than other parts of the brain. In this way, a brain size correlates with intelligence in the same way body size correlates with strength. Now, bigger bodies tend to be stronger than smaller bodies, but exceptions abound, and certain muscle groups can be more important than others, and certain types of muscle can be more important than others, right? And a similar kind of thing is occurring with the brain. But all else being equal, bigger brains tend to perform higher on standardized tests. Similarly, bigger bodies tend to perform better on standardized strength tests, which we would call lifts. 3. IQ tests don't perfectly measure intelligence. So even if brain size correlated with intelligence at 1, it wouldn't correlate with IQ at 1. Because the theory is that IQ is an imperfect measure of intelligence, kind of how a lift is an imperfect measure of strength. Yes, I know we can't discretely define intelligence, so it would be impossible to ever measure a correlation with intelligence, but we can use the concept of intelligence to explain why the correlation with IQ isn't 1, even though we can never get a pure definition or measure of intelligence. Okay, next. Surprise, surprise, brain size differs by race. Oh, I'm sure you didn't see that coming. The thing is, the total cranial capacity differences by races is small, but remember, humans are all the same species, and the cognitive differences between blacks and whites, for example, while profound in a modern industrial sense, are trivial in an evolutionary sense, right? Now, just flipping through the data here, the pause button is your friend, as are the links to the brain size stuff here. The issue is not that the racial gaps are really big, but that while small, they are consistent from study by study. Now, you can see there's a lot of variation in these studies depending on the methods they use of measuring the head. Sometimes they'll use external measurements, sometimes they'll use internal volume measurements, sometimes they'll just measure the length. But as long as the measurements are consistent, we can look within each study and see all the cohorts almost universally lining up in this matter. On a side note for you Rushton haters, if you compare Rushton's data on racial IQs and brain size, the data that he gathers, and Rushton actually does this, he actually goes out and gathers data. The data that he gathers is not much different from other researchers in the field. Here is some data on the cranial capacity of various races in the U.S. Army. This comes from measuring heads for the appropriate helmet size. So the people who assembled this data never intended for it to be used in any kind of racial analysis. So any kind of measurement bias would be unlikely or less likely than from someone who knew what the data was going to be used for. The top line of closed circles is Asian men, which I will assume is East Asian. The line below that of closed circles is white men. The line below that of closed triangles is black men. The zigzag line below that of open circles is Asian women. The line below that with open squares is white women. And the line below that with open triangles is black women. But this presents a paradox. Why do women have roughly equal IQs despite the much larger male brain? Well, here's some data from a paper from the University of Madrid entitled Negligible Sex Differences in General Intelligence. In it, the researchers found males with much greater abilities in spatial rotation, and in a test developed by the researchers called Manidas, I think that's money in Mexican, which was designed to identify the male-female gap. There were 2 sample groups in the study, and you can see the study and read the data for yourself. I'm just flashing through that data. Now, at the conclusion of the study, they said this, quote, Lynn has noted that the 4 IQ points male advantage he had obtained is the advantage that can be predicted from their larger brains. This prediction is based on a correlation of 0.35 between in vivo brain size and WAIS, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, IQ, and a sex difference of 0.78 standard deviation in adult brain size. 3 issues on the Lynn study are worth noting. 1. The sex differences in intelligence vary at different ages, so that aggregating them for all ages and concluding that no differences exist is not a satisfactory approach. 2. Sex differences fluctuate in tandem with sex differences in brain size. And 3. Sex differences are about 1.5 IQ points up to the age of 14 to 15, and thereafter increase steadily to approximately 4 IQ points among adults. However, considering the data of Lynn, Acne has calculated that 88% of the 4 IQ points favoring males is derived from their higher performance on reasoning and spatial tests. Almost all of the differences are due to the male advantages in spatial and math reasoning ability. This suggests that these tasks must require more brain tissue than do those tasks at which women have higher scores, verbal ability and perceptual speed. Moreover, the sex difference in brain size could be explained considering the greater packing density of neurons in the female brain. This sexual dimorphism allows the same number of neurons in the male and female brains despite their differences in gross size. Variation in total brain size accounts for only a minor part of the total variance in G or in IQ. And this is more mainstream acceptance of the G factor. Okay, continuing. Thus, other physiological factors unrelated to brain size must also contribute a large part of the G variance. On the other hand, the mean that can be calculated after tables 1 and 2 of the present study are D equals 0.2 and 0.23, whatever, respectively. These values translate into 3 and 3.4 average IQ points favoring males, not so far from the 4 IQ points calculated by Lynn in 1994, close quote. Okay, so the male-female brain size gap can be chalked up to 3 factors. 1, males do actually have slightly higher IQs. 2, males have a different pattern of scores, and the areas males excel in may require more brain tissue. And 3, the female brain has more tightly packed neurons. With the male-female brain size difference accounted for, the aggregate brain size differences between the races can be chalked up as another piece of evidence in favor of the hereditarian hypothesis, although really any one of these pieces of evidence is enough to make the hereditarian case. Admixture studies. Well, we've already seen the Willerman study, whose results were whites 105, mulattoes with white mothers 102, mulattoes with black mothers 93, and blacks 91. Now, Jensen argues that the white mothers had a higher educational level than the black mothers in the mulatto sample, and so probably had a higher IQ, and due to associative mating, the father also probably had a higher IQ. And while this may be true, to me this appears to be very weak sauce, and I think Jensen is stretching a little bit here. It's much easier to explain the gaps within the mulatto population as being a result of parental environmental effects. But at any rate, mutts are in the middle. Next, from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. It was mainly a study of health of over 83,000 kids with an average age of 16, but they also had a quick picture vocabulary test, and they looked at the GPAs of these kids. Instead of telling us the GPAs or test scores, they simply say the percentage of each group with a high GPA or the percentage with a high PVT. Now, first, the mulattoes, whites, and blacks. As expected, mutts are in the middle on both GPA and PVT, nothing interesting there. The Asian sample did have something interesting, and by Asian I assume they mean East Asian. The white Asian hybrids have a percentage with high GPAs intermediate between the pure whites and Asians, and their PVT is also intermediate. Okay. Now, whites generally have higher verbal intelligence than East Asians, and the fact that hybrids scored intermediate on this little test is evidence that, along with the prevalence of myopia among East Asians, the difference in the pattern of intelligence between East Asians and whites is genetic in origin. East Asians tend to have higher overall IQs than whites, and this is because of their higher IQs in nonverbal IQ. And myopia, and I've already been over this. We can also look at the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. A user named Socrates856 was in a video directed at me, was talking about an Asian cohort in the study. And so I'm going to link both Sandra Scar's and Arthur Jensen's papers on the study and their conclusions. Neither party mentioned the Asian cohort. Sandra Scar actually ran the study, and she didn't mention the Asian cohort in her paper. So if you want to chide me for not mentioning it, you should chide the Egalitarian as well, right? Instead of just attacking me and Rushton and Jensen. Moreover, the Asian cohort was heterogeneous and included Indians, Koreans, etc., and so is useless in terms of a racial analysis. Okay, even egalitarians would recognize that it was useless to include, which Sandra Scar did recognize, which is why I believe she didn't include it. But this is so obvious if you understand anything about the debate that's going on. Anyway, Tizard. Now, even Tizard, which puts blacks at the top, wow, shows mulattoes in the middle, right? The intermediate characteristics of people of intermediate racial type is more evidence that these things are genetic. Eyferth. it's still a bit unbelievable that people still cite Eyferth. My eyes always glaze over a little bit whenever there's another Eyferth sighting. The Eyferth study involved the children of German mothers who were raped by American soldiers, including some who were raped by black men and some who were raped by white men. The kids were given an IQ test between the ages of 5 and 13, and these were the results. White boys 101, white girls 93, mixed race boys 97, mixed race girls 96. This study has been used by egalitarians as evidence that adoptive environment is more important than race in terms of IQ. There are lots of things wrong with this study. First off, 20 to 25% of the fathers in this study were North African. They were not black. Second off, the blacks in the U.S. Armed Forces had a 30% dropout rate due to failing a military IQ test versus a 3% dropout rate for the whites. Thus, the black population had the bottom 30% cut out, while the white population had only 3% cut out. So the black rapists were an elite group, whereas the white rapists were less of an elite group. Third off, the tests were done while the children were between ages 5 and 13. It was before puberty, and I believe it also had a low sample size, though I don't recall the sample size. Anyway, the study is worthless. Anyone who cites Eyferth for anything is a profoundly stupid person, and that's all that needs to be said about Eyferth. Diet and nutrition. The general argument is that diet is responsible for the differences in IQ and or brain size differences between the races. First, this is highly implausible since blacks in the U.S. seem to have a robust enough diet to outperform whites in sports involving speed and speed strength, and to have a higher rate of obesity than whites. From Richard Lynn's paper, Race Differences in Intelligence, quote, "But as early as 1918, the heights of American conscripts were 170.96 centimeters for whites and fractionally greater at 171.99 centimeters for blacks. A further study published later in the 20th century has confirmed that there is no difference in height between American blacks and whites at the ages of 4 and 7 years or among adults. Surveys of nutrition have also failed to find any differences between American blacks and whites. For instance, a survey of 1987 to 88 found that in a representative sample of 2,379 9 to 10-year-old girls, 20% of blacks and 25% of whites had below the recommended daily allowance of 45 milligrams a day of vitamin C. The first health and nutrition examination survey of girls up to the age of 15 found no difference between blacks and whites in low vitamin C intake. Other dietary deficiencies are likely to be associated with vitamin C deficiency, so these results suggest that American blacks do not experience any greater nutritional deficiency than whites. Breastfeeding. Well, maybe diet in general isn't the problem, but it's that white mothers breastfed their children at an early age more often than black mothers, and it's this crucial early nutrient stuff that's really important. Now, according to medicine.net, black mothers breastfeed at a rate of 54.4%, white mothers breastfeed at a rate of 74.3%, and Hispanic mothers breastfeed at a rate of 80.4%. A study was done by Avshalom Kapsi, and while the purpose of the study that I'm citing and showing here was to analyze gene-environment interaction in regard to breastfeeding, the study also had great example of the effects of breastfeeding on child IQ. And as you can see, just flipping through here, breastfeeding doesn't seem to be a major determinant of child IQ. The major determinant of child IQ is, drumroll please, the mother's IQ. Next, to finally put the nutrition argument to bed completely, there were some studies involving malnourished East Asian children who were later adopted. Clark and Hannessy in 1982 published a study called Intellectual and Adaptive Performance of Asian Children in Adoptive American Settings in the Journal of Developmental Psychology. It involved 25 4-year-olds from Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Korea. Half of the babies had been hospitalized prior for malnourishment prior to adoption, and the population here achieved a median IQ score of 120. Winnick, Meyer, and Harris in 1975 published a study called Malnutrition and Environmental Enrichment by Early Adoption in Science magazine. It involved 141 Koreans tested at age 10. The severely malnourished group scored 102, moderately malnourished group scored 106, and the well-nourished group scored 112. And by malnourished, they mean they were hospitalized before age 2 due to malnutrition. So in this extreme case, there was a 10-point gap between the groups. That gives one an idea of how much nutritional deficiencies can matter in these extreme cases. Hot off the heels of the failure of the Head Start program to produce any lasting IQ gains, the Abecedarian Project was conducted with children from infancy to age 5, and they were compared to a control group that was not involved in the study. They then had follow-up studies done at ages 12, 15, and 21. And according to the University of North Carolina Child Development Institute, IQ gains lasted all the way to 21. Wow. Looks like a slam dunk for egalitarianism. I guess the problem with the old intervention programs is just that they weren't intense enough. Pop out the champagne, we proved the racists wrong. One problem though, infants were brought into the program at an average age of 4.4 months. By 6 months old, the experimental group had an average IQ, baby IQ, 6 points higher than that of the control group, and by age 15, the experimental group was 5 points higher. And given measurement errors and the difficulty to analogize infant IQ to adult IQ, that's virtually the same. So what could have happened in 1.6 months to get such a huge gain, and why, over the next 4.5 years, was there virtually no gain from being in the program? Well, the hereditarian hypothesis is that these children in the experimental group had innately higher IQs, and that this early intervention program didn't produce any IQ results. I guess the egalitarian hypothesis would be that intervention caused the gains, and the continued intervention allowed the children to just hold on to those gains even after the intervention was stopped at age 5. Is the black-white IQ gap narrowing? Maybe, probably not. To explain this, I need to explain a little bit more about IQ. Your score on an IQ test is rank order. The white average is set to 100, everything else is based off of that. William Dickens and James Flynn believe that the black-white IQ gap is narrowing, but at the very end of their survey they say, our data give a current IQ for blacks age 24 of 83.4, or exactly 1.1 standard deviations below whites. And this was from 2006. Apparently it was even wider than that in the past. Rushton and Jensen, in their response to Flynn and Dickens, said Flynn and Dickens cherry-picked studies that supported their conclusions, whereas if you took all the relevant studies into account, you would find that the IQ gap narrowing has been insignificant. If you want to read about that, I have Flynn and Dickens' paper and Rushton's and Jensen's response linked in the description. Rushton and Jensen also point out that Flynn and Dickens' optimism is based on gains from young black children. And it is very well established that young children are more influenced by changes in environment than adults are. That is, it could be improvements in the environments of young black children, but since the effects of shared environment fall to 0 by age 24, these gains probably won't matter. Moreover, SAT test score gaps have not been narrowing over this period. So if black IQs were rising, it's not having any effect on the SAT, nor is it having any effect on the black-white income gap, which recently has been starting to widen again. Stereotype threat. Stereotype threat has been created experimentally. The pioneer study on this was done by Claude Steele, where students were given racial stereotype threat cues prior to the test. When stereotype threat was present, the blacks did worse than the whites. When stereotype threat wasn't present, the blacks did about as good as the whites. But these college students scored similarly on the SAT prior, so all that happened in absence of stereotype threat was that the black students scored at their expected level, roughly. From the University of Minnesota paper entitled On Interpreting Stereotype Threat as Accounting for African American White Differences on Cognitive Tests, quote, rather than showing that eliminating threat eliminates the large score gap on standardized tests, the research actually shows something very different. Specifically, absent stereotype threat, the African American white difference is just what one would expect based on the African American white difference in SAT scores, whereas in the presence of stereotype threat, the difference is larger than would be expected based on the difference in SAT scores. In other words, Steele only showed he could persuade black students to do worse than they did on the SAT. He did not show that he could make black Stanford students score better. Steele's study has, of course, been replicated many times, but who cares, because they all have this same problem. Moreover, blacks have higher self-esteem and higher intellectual self-assessment than whites, which would be very odd if they were suffering from stereotype threat systematically. What's also odd is how consistent the IQ scores are, with blacks scoring at 83.5 in 1918 and peaking at 85 today. Are we really to believe that there has been zero reduction in racial stereotypes since 1918? Well, maybe there was a little bit, and the egalitarians are going to say that's where the 1.5 points came from. Actually, they'll say that it's more than that because they think the black IQ is actually higher than 85, but that's a different topic. Joe Wichards did a meta-analysis in 2009 of 55 studies on stereotype threat, and according to Wikipedia, he found a publication bias. That is, studies that showed stereotype threat were much more likely to get published than studies which didn't. Wichards concluded that when taking both published and unpublished studies into account, that there was no stereotype threat. Now here's just something that was said from a program for a meeting of the International Society for Intelligence Research. Quote, numerous laboratory experiments have been conducted to show that African Americans' cognitive test performance suffers under stereotype threat, i.e. the fear of confirming negative stereotypes concerning one's group. A meta-analysis of 55 published and unpublished studies on this effect shows clear signs of publication bias. The effect varies widely across studies and is generally small. Oh, it's small. Although elite university undergraduates may underperform on cognitive tests due to stereotype threat, this effect does not generalize to non-adapted standardized tests, high-stakes settings, and less academically gifted test takers. Stereotype threat cannot explain the difference in mean cognitive test performance between African Americans and European Americans. However, I cannot find any recording of this presentation or paper on this topic. I have contacted Wichards asking him for anything on the matter, and he responded by saying that he was currently working on a paper on this topic and that it was complicated and it would take a very long time. Robert Putnam spent 5 years on a study called, which was later called The Downside of Diversity, in which he found that diverse neighborhoods stunk, that they had less social capital, less neighborhood trust and stuff. And so he tried to find a way to falsify the obvious truth that like likes like by controlling for all sorts of things, controlling for all sorts of economic factors and locations and urbanization and stuff like that. And he spent 5 years trying to falsify this conclusion, and he didn't. And he eventually ended up publishing the study saying, yeah, diverse neighborhoods are kind of sucky. So what I'm wondering here is if Wichards is similarly wasting our time in order to try to find a way that there is not publication bias regarding stereotype threat. Anyway, my opinion is that stereotype threat is one big fraud. If it did exist, it would have been noticed much earlier by IQ researchers, and I think Steele's students gave him what he wanted to hear in that pilot study. You know, they got a low score on a test precisely when a low score on that test would be used to advance an egalitarian agenda. These black students have been black their entire lives, and they've known about the stereotypes their entire lives, and yet they managed to get into that college, Stanford, and they managed to have an SAT of that score. So they managed to do all this, but we are to believe that as soon as a test was given to them in this one instance where a low score would be used to advance an egalitarian agenda, they just happened to be overcome by stereotype threat. Guns, germs, and steel. One bizarre argument I get from egalitarians is the guns, germs, and steel argument. The argument is that different levels of civilizations can be traced to environmental differences, not the innate differences of the people. For example, the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa had fewer domesticatable plants and animals, and they had poorer, thinner soil. And the egalitarians, they'll make this leap that because physical environment can explain civilization differences, that means that all of these populations we call races must be innately the same in the brain on average. Not only is that a non sequitur, but this whole argument is a horrible straw man. Nobody is saying that environment doesn't matter, not even today. Nor are the hereditarians claiming that ancient civilizations were created in some areas and not others because of the innate intelligence of the people in the given areas. If that were true, then the first civilizations would have sprung up in Mongolia. Moreover, we can look at two countries within Africa, or within sub-Saharan Africa. We can look at South Africa and Botswana. And we can look at their level of economic freedom, and we can see that they're some of the wealthiest countries in Africa, despite even despite the relative declines under the ANC. South Africa is still one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, the second wealthiest in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I'm not saying that economic freedom is the only component of the wealth of an area. Natural resources and human capital are also important, but I am saying that the lack of the proper natural resources requisite for early civilization in the past is not why Africa is poor today, since we can see actual African countries that are better off than the rest of Africa by simply having more economic freedom. Okay? The gap between South Africa and Botswana and Congo is evidence that Congo's poverty today is not traceable back to the dawn of civilization, or the environmental disadvantages they had at the dawn of civilization. What makes a country wealthy is a variety of factors, and nobody I associate with or endorse would reduce all international economic differences to any one factor. If we did that, we would be saying things like North Korea is full of people with brains the size of a walnut, and that Eastern Europeans are about half as intelligent as Western Europeans. In fact, the hereditarian model is actually more sophisticated than Diamond's environmental determinism, since hereditarians incorporate innate intelligence as a factor in national wealth, whereas Diamond, by assuming all races are the same in the brain, has one less factor to work with in explaining the world. Diamond then makes a passing remark about New Guineans probably being smarter than white Europeans. So I guess he thinks all races are the same in the brain except New Guineans, and so he does accept that environmental pressure can differently affect human brain development depending on where the people were located. Like in this case, New Guineans, and they're smarter. I think that was a Freudian slip on Diamond's part, right, where he forgot to keep up the act of environment not having pressures on brain development, and so he accidentally slipped back into intellectual honesty. All this is to say that Jared Diamond's work is completely irrelevant and does nothing to explain, for example, why the various races perform differently within Britain or within Europe. Now, you can say it's economic deprivation. You can say the gaps within the US and Europe are caused by racism, quote unquote, or the lingering effects of a history of oppression, all of which I would disagree with, but the reasons for Africa's civilizational poverty compared to the Europe in the 1500s is not directly relevant to the black-white, the various racial gaps within the US and Europe. You can say that these things are tangentially related to the fact that Africa didn't have domesticatable plants and animals and had poor soil and so got conquered and Africans got oppressed in this way. But that serves simply as an explanation for why blacks got oppressed, but that's it. It's tangentially related. You still have to argue that blacks are still either oppressed or suffering from the effects of prior oppression today, and you have to tackle all of the IQ arguments and all of the stuff about what's happening today. If you think it's caused by, environmental poverty in the past, that's fine, but you still have to argue about today, right? Because the evidence today still exists. Okay. Guns, Germs, and Steel does not invalidate current hereditarian arguments, and it doesn't get one out of having to argue about the broad arc of data that exists today. You can raise your IQ. Through special training, an individual can raise their IQ, proving that IQ is malleable. This is true. But it doesn't mean what you might think it means for two reasons. One, let's say you get one of those Raise Your IQ courses and you do exercises for a year and raise your IQ by 14 points. Does this mean you're really that much smarter? Probably not. What you've done is figured out the test, and so now the test doesn't really work for you the same way it works for other people. Two, even if you raise your true intelligence, we basically already know this. Through weight training, you can increase your strength. In fact, most people can double their physical strength through proper training. Let's say that the average woman, through proper training, could become stronger than the average man. I think this is true. Does this mean that the strength gap between men and women on aggregate has no genetic component? And let's imagine that some intense intervention project like the Abecedarian Project actually worked and really raised the underlying general intelligence that IQ tests try to measure. So much so that the random group of black children put into this program ended up having an average IQ of 100. Does this mean that the IQ gap between blacks and whites has no genetic component? What if white kids were put in that environment, in that the equivalent of the mental equivalent of weight training, in an environment the likes of which we haven't come close to creating, I might add? According to Mensa, by training yourself, you can raise your IQ by about 14 points. If every black person trained themselves and raised their IQ by 14 points, we could rejoice that the black-white IQ gap had gone away, and then sit in shock as we find it has virtually no effect on anything else, because all that training did was really make the test useless. Correlation is not causation. Wah, wah. This, along with racist pseudoscience, is another one of those egalitarian parrot phrases. It's true, correlation is not causation. There is a correlation between drinking Drano and dying. Does this mean that drinking the Drano caused you to die? Well, you may point to how Drano affects body chemistry, but then again, the change in body chemistry merely correlates with drinking Drano. That doesn't mean that drinking Drano caused the change in body chemistry. Maybe it was some other thing you did, the pose you took while drinking Drano. Maybe that changed the body chemistry. And it's that thing that causes the dying, not the, you haven't established causation. Okay? And we can play all these games forever because there's no objective link. Or let's look at atoms. An atom with a positive charge tends to connect to atoms with a negative charge. Oh, but that's just a correlation. It's a strong one, but it's merely a correlation. Also, on a side note, what the heck is a charge? What the heck is a force? So what is causation? Well, this may be hard for the simplistic egalitarian mind to comprehend, but causation is entirely inferential and hypothetical. We infer causes about everything down to the atomic level, but all that we objectively see are associations and correlations. And from these correlations, based on all the other evidence, we merely infer a hypothetical cause. All science is this way. But when you really think about it, what would a cause even be? The very notion of causation itself is non-cognitive if you actually think about it. But back in the real world, we use the concept of causation even though we cannot define or even conceptualize what a cause would be. And we do so because the concept of a cause, even though we can't fully conceptualize it, is useful in practice. Correlation is not causation. Causation is theoretical and inferential. I don't consider myself an expert on the philosophy of science, but I do consider the people I'm talking to, atheist cult, to be complete morons. You can't pinpoint the genes associated with IQ. You can't find every transitional form. You can't find every single gene and their allele frequencies and how these allele frequencies affect IQ and how these allele frequencies differ between the races. You can't find all these things, so therefore we're going to assume that it's environmental. Well, actually, we can pinpoint a few. CHRM2, DTM-BP1. The problem, though, is that genes are complicated, much more complicated than simply having one gene on or off, or this frequency or that frequency of this specific gene. Genes are interactive, and so the effect of a certain allele will have a different effect depending on the metadata of the rest of the genetic code. Now, I can point to the allele frequency differences of the gene DTM-BP1 and see their observed effect on IQ of the HapMap sample studied with 3 populations, the Nigerians, the Dutch, and Japanese, and how these alleles are distributed between the races studied. But this is highly dubious because it's not taking into consideration the interactive effects of DTM-BP1. So we don't know if DTM-BP1 is causing it or if it's some other genetic data associated with it. In the study, genome-wide association studies establish that human intelligence is highly heritable and polygenic. A study conducted by 32 researchers, they have been unable to find the specific genes and/or gene clusters associated with IQ that explain group differences in IQ between the populations they sampled. However, they were able to infer that IQ was highly heritable somehow, but they didn't find the specific associations. This study has been going on for over a year and is a collaborative project of 19 different universities worldwide. Now, in my debate with the skeptical heretic, quote-unquote debate, the skeptical heretic admonished me for not being able to specify the gene allele frequency differences between the races that explain the IQ gaps. He said that it would be very easy to do so. It would be very easy to find these things, and he knows this. And the reason he knows this is because he works with the machines that sequence the genomes. We know he works with the machines because he said so. So, the skeptical heretic should get in contact with the people working on this project, because so far 32 researchers from 19 different universities have been unable to do it. And it would greatly advance science if the skeptical heretic, if you, showed them how. Anyway, before we even knew about the double helix, we inferred that some animals were more or less intelligent than other animals through the use of mental tests. And also, the gaps could be so obvious that we would just look at their behavior. We also don't know all the genes that explain why different animals are smarter than other animals, yet we infer that they do. Why do we, what are the gene allele frequency differences between a dolphin and a pigeon that cause a dolphin to be more intelligent than a pigeon? Also, how are we defining intelligence? I mean, we could get more dickish here. We could say, how are we defining intelligence that we know that a dolphin is smarter than a pigeon? We can get prickish and asinine. This demand that the specific genes be found is unreasonable, because if intelligence is extremely polygenic and is influenced by thousands of genes from information that is infused from the metadata, then it could take decades to untangle all of these interactions. It's also hypocritical, as this standard is not used when comparing other animals. Now, I must hand it to Sophia Roon for being consistent. Sophia Roon said that we can't determine race and intelligence without finding the specific genes associated with it, the allele frequencies associated with it. And so I asked her if we couldn't determine that some animals are smarter than others without finding the specific genes, and she said we could not. That is, we couldn't determine whether a dolphin was innately smarter than a salamander until we found the specific gene frequencies. So, unlike the rest of atheist cult, Sophia Roon is actually applying her principles consistently. So, I applaud her consistency. Conclusion. What the egalitarians like to do is compare hereditarians with creationists, and this is a very, very odd parallel to draw for a few reasons. One, the hereditarians are the pro-evolutionary party in the sense that they are widening the effects of evolution, while the egalitarians are narrowing the scope of evolution. That is, hereditarians point to evolutionary origins of racial differences. Egalitarians deny evolutionary cause. Now, they can't deny things like skin tone differences, muscle differences, bone differences, since that's all too obvious. They only limit the scope of evolution-caused racial differences to the black box of the brain. And they were able to do this for a long time because the brain was a black box before we could see it, before we could measure it and stuff. This is paralleled with biblical creationists denying the scope of evolution beyond microevolution. Now, this doesn't mean that the egalitarians are wrong, but they are the evolution limiters in this debate. 2. In the U.S., racial egalitarianism is the default position. Similarly, some form of creation is the default position in the U.S., be it young earth creationism or intelligent design. Now, people are moving in the way of evolution, and similarly, people are moving more and more in the way of racial hereditarianism in the U.S., except for physical and cultural anthropologists. 3. Unreachable standard, the creationist. Unless you can find every single transitional fossil, you can't justify evolution. The egalitarian. Unless you can find every single gene structure and its interactions associated with intelligence, you cannot justify hereditarianism. 4. General unreasonableness. With evolution, you have this heuristic theory that explains the world very well. While not all the transitional forms can be found, the theory has excellent predictive and retrodictive power. What creationists do is they challenge evolution to an unreasonable ideological degree. With hereditarianism, you have this heuristic theory that explains the world far better and far more simply than the complex and exotic cultural theories. We can see how different races being of different aggregate innate intelligences can explain what we see much better than cultural theories. For example, how do you explain that blacks have higher IQs in early development but lower IQs later in development, along with the fact that the heritability of IQ increases with age? Different development arcs of the races explain this simply and elegantly. The egalitarians must form some mess of cultural theories. Now, they could explain how heritability of IQ would increase with age. They could explain how the black-white IQ gap could widen with age. But a cultural theory, on the surface, it seems, there's a contradiction between a cultural explanation of the widening gap and the increased genetic component of IQ with age. Now, I can explain my theories in a few hours. I could explain it much shorter if I just did a bare bones presentation. Explanation of egalitarian theories for these things takes semesters. Egalitarians challenge hereditarianism to an unreasonable ideological degree. Like biblical creationists, they think they are on a mission from God because they are fighting racists. And you see it. Any video that is remotely sciencey sounding and makes an argument against racism gets flooded with likes. There is no discourse. Nobody's listening to the other side because they're fighting scientific racism. And what is scientific racism? Well, simply put, it's hereditarians who actually argue that evolution didn't stop at the neck. If you don't argue, you're just a simplistic bigot. If you do argue, you're a scientific racist and a suit-and-tie racist who pushes racist pseudoscience. These are all buzzwords designed to shut down discourse. There's also an amazingly selective skepticism. Zonstar, for example, says that blacks and whites don't differ in average IQ. They don't differ in average IQ. This is so obviously false that one must do a double take. The current debate on race and intelligence and IQ has to do with the cause of these extant gaps. The debate is about how much of it is genetic, if any. Okay, that's the debate. The debate is not whether or not they exist, because they do. But what's telling is that atheist cult didn't call him out on it. They didn't argue against it. He was saying something sciencey sounding, and it was against racism, and so they ate it up. Skeptical heretics said that we could easily sequence and identify specific gene association clusters with IQ and their distribution among races, and that we know this because he worked with those machines. Right? No skepticism against that. No calling him out on that. Evogen videos said that the heritability of IQ was 0. Again, no skepticism, no questioning, none of that. Concordance said that race differences in height are due to nutrition, not genetics. So East Asian people in the U.S. who are about 3 inches shorter than whites and blacks, that difference is a result of them not having the proper nutrition, right? Even though they earn more, even though they have higher average incomes than blacks and whites, their shorter stature is a result of nutrition. Anubis 2817 also loudly proclaimed that standardized tests are culturally biased. And this view is not even held by serious egalitarians anymore. Like, nobody believes this. Like, these ideas are 70 years out of date. They're like 70 years irrelevant. Nobody thinks that IQ tests are nobody serious who understands it. I mean, maybe some like black studies people would think it, but no serious egalitarian thinks that the IQ tests are culturally biased against black Americans anymore. None of these claims were vetted by atheist cults. They were blindly accepted because they were smart-sounding and were against racism. Asymmetrical Warfare said it best when he said that he could have read the phone book, said that it proved racism wrong, and would have gotten a standing ovation. 5. Creationists hate race and accuse Darwin of racism. When I was a fundy, I believed men were all equal at birth. That God created man as a singular entity, not as divided races, but as one humanity under God. I viewed any talk of race as sinful in the eyes of God, and religious fundamentalists hate racism. Now, I haven't done a poll or systematic survey of this, but my personal experience, which is a few years, and the fact that the churches were crucial in both the abolitionist movement and the passage of civil rights, and, you know, for example, Fred Phelps was a civil rights activist, and every creationist I've talked to has held radical egalitarian views on race. Now, you can go through the Bible and you can find passages that appear to support race-based oppression, and you can find passages that oppose race-based oppression, right? You can find passages justifying anything in the Bible. I'm not talking about what the Bible actually says. I don't care about that. I'm talking about what Christians think it says, which is what really matters. And in this regard, they are radical egalitarians. Let's listen to what Darwin had to say about race. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace these savage races throughout the world. The break between men and his nearest allies will then be wider. I could show Fight on Natural Selection having done more for the progress of civilization than you seem inclined to admit. The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. Now, Charles Darwin was also anti-slavery, so I'm not sure how to square his views on slavery with what he said here. Francis Galton, who invented the statistical concept of correlation and regression to the mean. So whenever you make a correlation, you know, thank Galton. Galton was a pioneer in meteorology, and he invented the first weather map. So Galton was a smart cookie, and he had similar views on race to Charles Darwin, and he was a eugenicist. The anti-slavery abolitionists in America didn't have, I mean, there's no evidence that they had egalitarian views on race, the way it's defined today. That is, they didn't think that the Negro was innately as capable as a white person. Abe Lincoln certainly never believed this. The movement against racial slavery was not based on some insane, impossible notion that the races ended up the same in the brain, but it was based on moral grounds. The idea was that God created man equal in moral worth. I actually disagree, with this moral equality argument. I don't think all individuals are of equal moral worth, nor do I think the races are an average of equal moral worth, since the races have different levels of psychopathy, theft, and murder rates. I also view voting for welfare as immoral. For example, I would view voting for Obama to be an immoral act, roughly the equivalent of stealing $1,000 from someone. But I digress. My point here is that the abolitionist and later the civil rights movements were founded on moral arguments about moral equality. And even if you don't believe in moral equality between the races, you can still believe that no individual, regardless of race, should be treated poorly because of his race, even if it was proven that blacks on aggregate are less moral than whites on aggregate. Okay? This is the individualist view on the matter, and modern libertarians actually tend to have rather egalitarian views on race, both in the moral sense and in the radical anti-evolutionary sense. People like me and Laughing Man are actually the exception, although I don't know what Laughing Man thinks about moral equality. But this eminently modern view of racial brain equality is really quite unprecedented. It's radical, and it's a mostly Western phenomenon. It's not what the anti-slavery abolitionists thought. It's not what the civil rights advocates generally thought. It's not what the whole world generally thinks today. And if you subscribe to evolutionary theory, it's virtually impossible. It's really ahistorical what atheist cult is doing, to be such firm believers in evolution, but then have such anti-evolutionary views on race. The YouTube atheist cult holds essentially an environmental determinist position, which is a dead theory. I don't think they even quite realize how much modern science has completely bypassed what they believe, and it's not even particularly recent science that has bypassed this hardcore environmental determinism that they have. I don't know what the average IQ is of atheist cult, but I believe that because of their extreme and completely unfounded confidence in their opinions, and the way they do nothing but confirm their own opinions and make videos which generates social proof, and they cloak themselves in a bunch of citations, and it's the pattern of what they do. They assert and then source. They don't explain the data. They don't explain, this is the fade out of shared and unshared. They don't do things like that. They make an assertion and then source it. So what they're doing is they're clothing their assertions, which in a sense is nothing more than an appeal to authority. And so because of this, I think they have less of an ability to seek truth than the average man on the street does, because the average man on the street is more humble, even if his IQ may be a little bit less. Make the world flat. Now, when I first heard this, I was incredulous. Really. They want to make everything the same? They want to make all ideas and all peoples equal? Nobody can be that stupid. But I cannot deny the simplicity and elegance of this theory to explain what we see. And so, while at first I was very skeptical of this theory, it started to grow on me. We see them denigrating Christianity and elevating Islam. We see them denigrating traditional lifestyles and elevating alternative lifestyles. We see them denigrating white people and elevating black people. They're elevating that which is denigrated and denigrating that which is elevated. That's the pattern. Now, I'm not talking about the merits of these things right now. I'm just talking about the pattern of what they elevate and what they denigrate. And so it dawned on me. These people aren't interested in an accurate assessment of any of these things. They never were. They want to eliminate all perception of inequality. Reality is not really the main issue, because there is a higher truth, a higher goal. Now, I have no problem, for example, with alternative lifestyles. In fact, I live one, but I'm not going to pretend that it would be okay if everyone on the world lived as I did. These people do. This ambiguous they do. Because inequality between peoples, between ideas, between lifestyles, leads to the notion that one is superior and should displace the others. For example, Darwin, in his belief that some peoples are superior to others, believed that they would, and it's arguable whether or not he thought they should, displace and exterminate the other, more savage races. Okay. Because because this idea of inequality leads to war and justifies tyranny, according to this egalitarian view. So what should be done? As truth is not the goal, harmony is. Or one could say that more so that there is a higher truth, and that higher truth is that relativism, tolerance, and presumptions of equality between entities leads to a better world. Truth be damned. This extends to the marketplace, because the marketplace involves interacting with other people, and that produces incredible amounts of inequality between unequal people, right? Advocates of markets will say that markets on the whole are mostly fair, And there are gradients here. There are some people who believe, well, markets are not entirely fair, so we need some regulation to say, no, all the perceived unfairness in the markets is a result of government regulation. Okay, I don't want to talk about the merits of a free market economy right here, okay? But this burning desire for equality among the Egalitarians, what this does is it gives them an anti-market bias, and it leads them to seek out and form all sorts of complex arguments about why markets aren't fair. And again, I don't want to talk about the merits of any of this. I'm just talking about the psychology of this, or I don't know if psychology would be an appropriate term, but mass psychology? I don't know. Now, combine this egalitarian movement with the oceans of people who have little value to anyone, and what you've done is you've created a political movement with an intellectual elite and a mob of voters, which are people who have little value, and so they earn very little. And so their bizarre views on race and their opposition to markets are really just two elements of the same pathology. So they hate hierarchy and hierarchical ideologies, and they get absolutely giddy whenever a hierarchist gets something wrong. For example, thinking that whites are smarter than East Asians when East Asians end up being smarter. I would call these people anarchists, except that they tend to love state power. But then again, so do most self-proclaimed anarchists. I think egalitarian is a good name for them, in that they strive to push the world into a relativistic soup where nothing is deemed superior to anything else, or at least that relativistic soup is the theoretical ideal to be strived for, even if it cannot be fully achieved. And we will achieve harmony by denigrating that which is elevated and elevating that which is denigrated. And the only idea which is elevated above all is the idea of equality and the relativistic soup itself. That's the only idea that is elevated. And the only ideas that are to be attacked are those which describe, or worse, prescribe, a world in which things are not in fact equal. That is, the only ideas that are to be attacked that are less equal than the others are the ones that promote hierarchy, or either promote hierarchy or justify hierarchy in the market. And that's why you see an intense double standard at universities in regards to free speech. People are allowed to have all sorts of kooky beliefs as long as they don't promote hierarchy or justify already existing hierarchies or set themselves in opposition to the relativistic egalitarian non-order. So they're fine with free speech because they want free speech among all these kooky ideas that don't promote hierarchy, but if it promotes hierarchy, they don't want free speech, so that's called something else. It's called hate speech. So they want free speech, right? Because they want all these relativistic ideas to be seen as equal. But they don't want introduction of hierarchical beliefs, and so hierarchical beliefs are labeled hate speech. Equality is the goal. Make the world flat. Of course, it's a matter of degree. Not everyone wants to make the world completely flat. You know, there are some people who say, well, I think everyone should have equality in terms of the basic needs or something like that. But it is these degrees of flattening that separates the egalitarian mindset from the non-egalitarian or the sane mindset.